Good evening. Good evening. Just before I call the meeting to order, before we call the meeting to order, there's always a public question period. Typically, that's for questions. I understand there's more of a ad hoc delegation, which happy to entertain. So, who is it that wants to speak for us, or for? Yeah, if you want to just take the podium and speak into the mic. Yeah.
So my name is Jill Branson. I'm a parent and personal user of the Canmore Recreation Center. Sorry, thank you. Along with Sarah Anderson, who is president of the Canmore Minor Hockey Association, and Deb Mayberry, who is another Canmore citizen, are here with me today. We are here today to represent a unified group of CRC users. We as stakeholders would like to ask for the summer months to work cooperatively with administration to explore improvements and optimization, as well as funding sources for the CRC Life Cycle project, with the end result being an improved project the whole community can be proud of. The CRC is a great public facility, and we owe it to all the members of the community to look at future programming requirements when considering the life cycle scope of this 24-year-old building. We are thankful for the work administration has done thus far. We recognize there has been many people that have pulled together to make this project happen to this point. This is a great opportunity for positive engagement to address community needs for the next 25 years. We believe that maintaining flexible spaces would work best to utilize the existing space to its fullest capacity. With Council's approval, we will collaboratively work with administration to bring ideas to Council for consideration early in September. We believe this project is worthwhile. We also believe this project can still be enhanced within the current financial envelope and possibly beyond, with grants, sponsorships, and building efficiencies, as well as with stakeholder involvement. Let's increase the strength of this valuable community asset together. A strong and functional recreation center will enable us to all realize the many social and economic benefits in the years to come. So my two questions to Council would be, is an engagement of the Recreation User Group Committee working with the town administration over the next couple of months an acceptable process?
Thank you very much. So I just want to understand then the intent. It's, I think you're clear in your letter that you're not expecting or looking for the option 2 that was presented initially to be reconsidered. So you're not asking for a reconsideration of the motion of Council, or are you?
Looking to look at what we have, working within the scope that was presented at last Wednesday's meeting, to make some modifications to some of the ideas that were presented to make it a better usable space. One idea is opening the concourse up on the top level and actually creating a walking track up there by having a more open space there. Having flexible walls versus fixed walls would be a great thing there, and give more room. When we looked at it, there were some pinch points with the bar server area and some other uses. A big consideration is looking at the Lady McDonald room as well, and we've come up with some ideas, but we don't know how it would fit in the scope of that.
Sure. Now then, Council clearly has directed administration to work with user groups to try to improve the design of the flex space, or to make it, I'm not too sure. So you don't want to see the project delayed. You just want some time to enhance or manage and massage the flex space on the second floor?
Both the top and bottom floor, to look at some different options that we have. I did speak with programming with Jim Yonker about that, and he would also like to see, some modifications that would make it best for all the user groups.
I think I would just add that at the user meeting, it was presented that the
plans were set. That was the understanding, and I think each user group has different ideas. There are, we think, opportunities to improve upon the recommendations that were brought to council within the financial envelope and not delaying the project, because we realize there are significant life cycle issues that have to be dealt with.
That's right. The cost of delaying is ominous, but that's not what I'm hearing. Certainly, I mean, if it's a simple answer to the question, the expectation of council is that the administration will continue to work with the user groups and find ways of making the project more flexible or more address the various user groups more readily. I'm not sure if I'm missing something, but
we got the message last Wednesday that we would be able to make recommendations on hooks, possibly.
On
or
which,
the type
I'm sorry?
of hooks that could be used in the change rooms,
Hooks.
or possibly to the extent of sinks, but not necessarily any changes to the walls. And for us, that was a bit shocking that there hasn't been as much engagement as we would have liked to have seen.
Yeah, so don't go away. We'll continue the dialogue, but Dr. Cottle, you've been engaged.
Perhaps I can clarify, because I was at the meeting, and so I know exactly what this group is speaking to. So the question that got asked at the user group meeting is the design set? Can the design fundamentally change? And to that, the staff response was no. The design cannot fundamentally change. There are, however, lots of ways that we can work with user groups to optimize the space. And that's where the hooks and sinks, as an example, are coming in, although certainly those aren't the other things. One of the things that got mentioned or asked by the Eagles was about the concourse. Could the wall come out, and could we make that a concourse? And our staff said that's something we could look at. What we can't do is fundamentally change the scope so that the budget changes, right? So the budget is set, and we have clear direction from council that we're not going with the different option, and that the budget we have is the budget we have. So are there tweaks and ways that we can make adjustments, like putting in accordion walls on the second floor? Absolutely. Can we look at things that are fundamental scope changes? No, we can't. Yeah. That's the message that we tried to deliver. It sounds like maybe it wasn't entirely effective.
Yeah, I think there's been some lack of good communication perhaps, but council has been clear that option one, and that budget is, we've been talking about that since the budget approval last fall. But within that budget and within that scope, there's all sorts of opportunity for changing things, walls or use. I'm intrigued by the suggestion that there may be an opportunity to open something up and allow for a walking track, as opposed to what was discussed when the consultant was here, which was essentially people walking back and up and down a hallway, which doesn't really meet the bill. But certainly it's a lot of money, and our council's hope is to see a project come out of it, or the facility come out of that with long-term viability for the whole community. I know that as our community grows and the user groups grow, there's more and more competition for the flex space that exists, and that's outside of this discussion. It really is up to the user groups at the regular user group meetings where space is assigned to learn to share the facility. But so the answer to the first question, I would say, and unless council disagrees, the answer is sure, the more engagement, the better. Will council consider an administration scope change provided they are cost effective and supported? Absolutely, we would discuss that if that's what's brought forward. I'm not sure if I'm answering your questions or not.
Yes, Your Worship and Council Member. I'm Sarah Anderson, and I'm the President of Canmore Minor Hockey. I guess the request where we come from, like about engagement with the council and administration, is just to have more like a partnering approach to this. I think we all want the same thing at the end, like a facility that like serve like do community, especially for Canmore Minor Hockey and the kids. And so it's like maybe engagement and partnering and collaborating with the administration to even understand like the needs of the user group, and not just in today's, but like have a vision really for the next 25 years. If this is the facility, they will end up having for 25 years. And even like the understanding where a user group come from. For example, like with this project, like council is going to invest a total of close to $12 million, like you know, in the community, in the recreation of the community. And yet, what it was proposed, like there is 4 rooms in for hockey changing rooms, lockers, like they will be below capacity, or what is like the minimum requirement for Hockey Alberta. So here comes like the question, for example, for Canmore Minor Hockey, like to have a more like an engagement with administration to see what we can do about this, considering that we spend all this money.
Yeah. So I'm not too sure. It sounds like there's different requests coming from different user groups, but the project always has been. The project always has been a life cycle replacement. It's either get the work done or knock the building down, and we all see the value of putting a substantial amount of money into the facility to keep it going for another 25 years to, as best possible, meet the needs of our community. So within the design of the spaces, I think there's flexibility, and that's what I'm hearing from administration, and that's what council's anticipating, I would think. But if it comes to a major redesign, that's not what I'm hearing.
We understand that, but I think that like there might be possible option and solution to address that. Same for like the space in the second floor with the flex room, or like the option or possibility to move like the concourse, and even introducing like a walking lane. It is not just serving like this group, but multiple group, and it's still like the #1 priority according to the master plan. So,
yeah, from my perspective, as long as the cost of the budget and the primary scope isn't significantly changed.
Well, that's why we want to be given time to look for fundraising opportunities and find a sponsor. We believe that is possible and feasible. Even looking at the ice plant, not knowing fully the report, but if we could have time to look at that, there is a possibility to delay putting in a new ice plant, and that would give us $1.5 million right there to do some additional enhancements and keep that ice plant and then bring that back on.
My understanding is the ice plant is on its last legs. Admin could speak to that because I don't know.
Yeah, so there's a couple of things about engagement I'm hearing here, and I understand the user group's frustration around engagement. Because this is a life cycle project, the engagement is happening now that we have designed. So administration's plan and sense of direction from council is that now we begin engagement on how to optimize given what we can afford in the design. And in the rink, the change rooms in one of the arenas are not being redesigned at all. There's no opportunity for that within the current scope of the project. So there are some things that user groups want that even in this next engagement, we're not going to be able to give them. One of the things around the ice plant, I just spoke, knowing that you all were coming, I spoke to the supervisor of the rec center. They're saying with the ice plant, it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And the further we delay, they're very nervous about delaying the project because they don't want to have a situation where the plant goes down and we have no ice in the middle of the season. So they've actually worked very hard on this project to have the enhancements and changes and life cycle issues happen when user groups are using the facility at its least. So any kind of delay, the ice plant is not an option to delay. So we do need to have some engagement now with these groups going forward, but it is not a laundry list of wishes. It is what we can do within the larger life cycle. So there is opportunity to give engagement on a lot of things, but not everything.
And thank you, Sally. And that's exactly what we wanted, some sort of engagement that hasn't happened really so so far, because it's been just information session, but not really like engagement
Excuse
of
me,
any sort.
sorry.
Sorry.
You could actually talk to the council and maybe lift the mic up a bit.
So I would say that that's exactly what we are looking for, like is some sort of engagement, because right now, like as a user group, we just receive information session regarding decisions that were already made. So like we would like just to be engaged in the process. That's what we are looking for.
Super, and the high-level decision has been made. I think you understand that. But within that, I believe there's quite a bit of room for working with the various user groups to find efficiencies and ways of using the space in the most responsive way.
And that's exactly what we are looking for,
Sure.
like, and to have at the same time, like having the time to finding additional sponsorship, and maybe we come up with the additional money to do.
Sure, I mean, we can't hit pause on the whole project until September. My understanding is that would cause significant issues on the functionality of the building and likely add cost to the project. But within the next couple of months, I understand there's quite a bit of opportunity to work with the planners to find ways of making it a better project.
So, Your Worship, is it fair to say the request here is to give time to September, and we understand that that is time for project planning. During that time, we can anticipate, as user groups, being approached by administration to look at what the possibilities are to enhance the space for users? Is that correct?
Open that dialogue, yeah, you bet. Just to engage. And I don't think it's not, there's no guarantees, but working with the community to make it the best project, sure. I don't know if other councillors have questions or input. So happy to hear from you from time to time and understand how it's proceeding on from your perspective. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think just, I don't know if our second question was raised properly. Would council consider an administration scope changes provided they are cost effective and supported? So within the budget and within the scope, that's a yes?
As far as I'm concerned,
okay.
Most likely. But sure, we're not here to be the bad guys. We're trying to build a community facility that meets everybody's needs as best possible with an eye on our overall financial capabilities, and I think everybody here understands that. So thanks very much for being here today, and we'll keep talking about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, then I will call the meeting to order, and
I have more questions.
Given the legal process, I don't think we can actually interact with you.
Yes,
No, you can't.
I'm not sure. My name is Blanca Survey. I'm not 100% sure of what was going to be asked, but I have an idea. The CCH housing project in the old daycare lands, there are restrictive covenants, I believe, that are going to be put on the titles of the properties, but in Alberta, those cannot be enforced.
Yes, they
so
can.
are you...
Yeah, they actually can. It's a legal mechanism that's used all over Alberta and, in fact, across the country. So restrictive covenant, in fact, it's used here in Canmore in a number of instances.
Well, there's a document here, and I'm not sure if are those CCHC meeting? Okay.
So you've asked the question, and I've answered it. Is there another question?
Sure, okay. In the minutes of the CCH, it actually says Alberta MGA does not provide for restrictive covenants to be enforced. Instead, should a municipality use a restrictive covenant and thereafter register a charging caveat on title to an affordable housing agreement, there is no guarantees that they will be enforceable against current or subsequent owners. Legal advice suggests that this is largely due to a potential public policy conflict, specifically the restraint against one's ability to dispose of his or her property.
What's your question?
Well, that restrictive covenants on titles cannot be enforced.
Yes, they can.
Well,
They're used across Alberta. In fact, here
well,
in
not
Canmore,
according.
talk with Spring Creek Mountain Village, they use restrictive covenants on some of their units.
Well, why does CCHC not believe that if they're supposed to be? CCHC, these are their minutes, and I thought they had the expertise in this.
Pardon me? Yeah, it's actually a question for the CCHC board.
But you're the shareholder.
Right here, I'm councillor. Now, I know because I work on the board that restrictive covenant is the model that CMHC is quite happy to move forward with. That's Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation. So unless you have another question, I'll ask you to take your seat.
I have a question as well on engagement, and I have a quick question on the mountain bike trail up in Quarry Lake Park. What's the process for that? Is there going to be engagement from the public? Does it have to be approved by council?
It's a trail project, just like dozens of trail projects we've engaged in over the several decades we've been building trails. It's been approved. The budget was approved. The process is approved. There is no public process for approving every single trail that the town builds or maintains.
Even if it doesn't follow the land use bylaw requirement for the park?
That's
no,
in your
well,
opinion.
it's a natural park. It's zoned as
the
natural
park
park.
that was purchased with the sole intent of meeting the recreational purposes of our community. That includes cycling, hiking, swimming. If you have a problem with that, you may want to communicate with Rocky Mountain Heritage Board, which is the group that purchased the land and took it out of possibility of development. It's a cherished recreational facility in this community.
It certainly is.
Yeah, and there's an awful lot of mountain bikers in this community that are looking forward to a trail design that will meet their need. And as you probably know, the whole point is to entice people out of the wildlife corridors. Now, you want to protect the wildlife corridors. Your neighbors don't seem to want to observe that. So this is a project that has been discussed and debated and approved. That's that.
But I believe that you're not clear on the intent of the natural park designation. Mm-hmm. It is to protect the land for wildlife use. It's not. It doesn't say recreational. Okay,
so I'm not hearing questions. I'm hearing debate. If you have a question, otherwise.
Are you aware of the definition of the land use bylaw, natural park definition, what it requires? Because the trail that's being proposed is not a permitted use in that land use bylaw. Are you aware that it's not a permitted use?
Mr. Fark.
So what I would say in response is, yes, clearly the town is very aware of the contents of the land use bylaw and what are permitted and discretionary uses in the Quarry Lake Park. In this particular case, a non-motorized trail is a discretionary use under the land use bylaw for that land use designation. And by virtue of council approving the project through the budget process, they have granted approval. It does not require a development permit, nor does it require an EIS. So the requirements of the land use bylaw have been met, and the project is entirely consistent with the land use bylaw.
In your opinion?
Okay, I think you've had your questions answered. Thank you.
Thank you.
That'll call the meeting to order. Look into the agenda. Are there changes or additions? I have one item I wanted to, well, let's let the chamber clear. there was one thing I wanted to walk onto the agenda, if council will allow me, which is simple question around the input to the province on the proposed electoral district. So I'll amend the agenda to add item, new business G3, G4, electoral district input. Councillor Russell.
Well, thank you, Your Worship. We've covered a bunch of it here, ad hoc, albeit. I wanted to see if we could add an item G5, I guess G5, not knowing you were coming with that, just to have a quick update on this Quarry Lake. Given the level of confusion that's out there, given the level of poor information that the public is throwing, that's being bandied around, and then given the weekend where we've got emergency services knocking on doors, warning people of hazards. Just a little bit of an update from administration would be nice, and just, I guess, an opportunity to hear that we are in fact doing it fine.
I would go under reports from administration, perhaps. So I1.
No problem. Thank you.
With that, I'll move the agenda be approved as amended. Those in favor?
Procedurally, you need a 2/3 motion vote to add those agenda items to the agenda, and then you would vote on the agenda.
Thank you. So I'll put the question on the table then for council to accept those two additions. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Then move that the agenda be approved as amended. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Now we have a delegation, Mr. Duncan from Ipsos. Ms. Hyde, you're introducing.
Quickly. Thank you, Mayor and Council. I am pleased to introduce Jamie Duncan from Ipsos. You'll remember Jamie, I think this is the third time he's led our citizen satisfaction survey project, and third time he's come to present here at Council. So we're happy to see him, and take it away, Jamie.
Your Worship, members of Council, thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I apologize in advance. I've got allergies like apparently half of Calgary at the moment, so I will speak softly, and if you can't hear me, please let me know and I will raise my voice. As Cheryl said, we've had the pleasure to partner with the town of Canmore for the last 3 iterations of your citizen satisfaction survey. My role at Ipsos, I've been there 15 years, and I oversee all of the work that we do in Alberta, both private and public sector, in addition to some work across the country. So I spend a fair bit of my time working with your counterparts in this province, looking at citizen satisfaction surveys for municipalities large and small. So 2 narratives that I'm going to be covering in today's presentation. The first one is how the town's measurements compare back to 2014. And the reason that I'm only comparing to 2014 is because we changed the time period between 2012 and 2014 when this survey was fielded from fall to spring. So we're going to focus really on sort of how have the numbers changed up or down versus that 2014 baseline. And where possible, I'm also going to provide council with some context in terms of how the results compare to other communities in Alberta. So whether or not you're on par, lower, or higher than what we typically see from our norms database. I'm happy to be here today on behalf of the 45 plus people who worked on this project at Ipsos through the month of April. And as you've seen in the package, in terms of the methodology, we followed the same methodological approach as we have in previous years. So a total of 300 Canmore residents were surveyed as part of this exercise. This year, we did employ 30% of that sample by cell phone. And as you can imagine, as Canadians continue to shift their behaviors, there are fewer and fewer households that are landline connected. And so as a standard across the industry, we strive for 30% or more of our telephone surveys completed through cell phone sample. Now, our margin of error is just over 7 points. In this particular iteration, that's important because there will be times as we move through these results where we see differences that look like they may be significant. They need to be greater than 7 points compared to the 2014 measurement for us to say that there's been any statistical change compared to the results that we had last year. And there are some, and I'll highlight those as we go through. So to begin, the very first question that we ask on the phone is an issue agenda question. And it's an opportunity for respondents to provide our interviewers with their own perspectives on the top issues facing the community. It's an open-ended question, so our interviewers record the verbatim response from the person on the phone. We have another team of people who review all of those responses, categorize them into themes, and then another person ends up doing the data analysis so we can see what the total percentages of people who said those specific things are. And so as you can see in 2017, the top issue according to residents relates to social components of the community. So affordable housing, availability of housing, the cost of living. This was also the top mention that we had in 2014. It's up slightly from where we were in the previous years. And you can see that there are net scores, just so that everyone understands what that means. The net is the cumulative theme for that particular item. And there are a number of mentions or another number of items that comprise a theme. Not all of them are shown on here. Administration is going to be given a package with the multitude of additional responses that are less than 2%, and I think there's over 50 of them that make up this list. But you can see social being the top, government services, wildlife management corridors being the mention within there, and then growth and development at number 3. Now, if we look at the right-hand box at where we were in 2013, I'm going to highlight specifically the growth and development mention in this issue agenda this year. We do note significant shifts in public perceptions on several key measurements. And our assessment, based on the data, is that these views are being impacted by how people feel about growth and development, whether they agree with a particular decision or disagree with a particular decision. And that carried through to our online survey, which we also provided people the opportunity who weren't randomly selected to participate in the survey, an online opportunity to provide their views and thoughts. And that theme carried through to those people as well. That there's a correlation between how you feel about growth and development in the community and how you respond to questions like the issues and some of the other ones that I'm going to cover in a second. The second topic that we look at in the survey relates to quality of life. And there's a lot of debate about, well, what makes up quality of life, and there are a number of things that contribute to it, education and healthcare, but ultimately municipalities at the end of the day are also attempting to shape and influence quality of life in their communities, and ultimately, hopefully, in a positive way. And that's why we ask this particular question. So when we ask residents in Canmore how they rate their quality of life in the community today, virtually everybody who responded say that they rate the quality of life as being either very good or good. We actually saw an increase of 5 points in the percentage of people who said that their quality of life was very good compared to 2014, and just a very small minority of people who rated it as being poor. And this is actually higher than what we see in other communities. Typically, we would have double or triple the number of people who say that their quality of life is poor, so somewhere between the 5 and 8% range. The other question that we look at is momentum, and whether or not people believe that quality of life in their community has improved, worsened, or stayed the same over the last 3 years. And you can see how that breaks down between 2017 and 2014. What I will note, Canmore is quite similar to its counterparts in Alberta, where we did see a rise in the percentage of people who said that their quality of life had worsened. And that's been a trend that we've been observing for the last 24 months as Alberta continues to work through the economic downturn. So that's not unique to Canmore, and we're starting to see an upswing when we look at this from a provincial perspective as well. So this year you do have slightly more people who say that quality of life has worsened than the percentage of people who say that quality of life has improved. We don't let people off the hook by just giving us that answer. We ask them to tell us why. So the next 2 slides highlight the responses. Among those, the 18% on this slide who said that quality of life had improved. And this is where you see, I'll give you a second while I get some water. This is where you see the beginning of a two-sided narrative around growth. So when we look at the 18% of people who say that quality of life has improved, the top rationale for that selection relates to growth and many of the benefits to growth: amenities, more businesses, more housing available, development just in general. And you can see parks and recreation, infrastructure, all the things that you would expect to see underpinning the concept of an improved quality of life appear on this list. Now, when we look at the 1/4 of respondents who told us that quality of life had deteriorated or worsened, we see growth and planning also at the top of that list. So it is a top mention among that, again, that 26% of people who say that quality of life has worsened. Those perspectives are the flip side to growth and the growth benefits. So too much development, population growth, too many tourists, traffic, too many part-time residents. And then you can see some of what I was talking about earlier around the economy. And that's, some of that's broader, not necessarily in the purview of council, but there are a number of things related to growth and planning that continue to contribute to this. I will note, however, that the magnitude of the responses among this group around growth and development has softened since 2014. So in the box on the right-hand side, 54% of those who in that year said that quality of life deteriorated provided us a response related to growth and development. This year, the economy has taken up some of that space among that cohort. So it's not to say that it's still a significant amount of people who say that this is contributing to their views on quality of life in the community. On to town performance. So this very first slide is broken into 3 statements. These questions are randomized so that we can so we have a sort of equal opportunity in terms of the ordering, and we ask respondents to rate council's performance excluding administration, administration's performance excluding council, and then the team's performance collectively, council and administration together. And this is on a 4-point word scale. In 2014, you can see the numbers were actually tied consistently across the board in terms of what the top 2 box measurements were for each of those 3 rating categories at 84%. We do see a change this year compared to where we were in the previous years. And really what we've seen is a slight softening of the very satisfied group and a similar softening in the somewhat satisfied group. So, some ground has been lost. We're down 8 points on the team as a collective whole. We've seen a 14 percentage point decrease from where we were on council on its own compared to 2014, and that 8-point decrease on administration versus where we were in 2014. And I'll go back to my point a few slides ago, that there are correlations to how people feel about growth and development. My last slide in this presentation relates to some attitudes about how people feel about growth and development. And if I disagree with those statements, and they're statements that sort of reflect the positive side to council and administration's performance on growth and development, if I disagree with those statements, I am more likely to provide a dissatisfied rating on this question than if I agree. So there is some indication continually through this around some of the challenges the community is facing as it relates to its growth issues.
Councillor Crowthwaite.
Thank you, Your Worship. If you don't mind me interrupting to ask a question on that previous slide. Yeah, I mean, it's still very strong, satisfied, but it is a decrease. What are you seeing around in other communities?
To be honest, this question varies community by community and issue by issue. And it also varies by seasonality. One of the things that I should have said at the beginning of this presentation is that these exercises are truly about measuring how people feel in a moment in time.
Right, okay.
And the moment in time that we happened to field this survey was right around a debate that council was having around growth and development, and that has been clearly reflected in these results. And so, I would be hesitant to draw a broad conclusion, but we do know that in places where we field surveys where there's a topic that is of public interest, we oftentimes see that reflected in that particular survey piece. And so we've had conversations with administration that this is one number. The hope is that you continue to measure this and to track and benchmark against this, and perhaps those numbers will increase over the next 12 months or 24 months.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. So for those who may have received a call from Ipsos and spent over 20 minutes on the phone with our interviewers, this was the section that consumed the most time. And there are a number of components. We asked people how satisfied they are with the town's delivery of programs and services overall. And then we asked them for each of the programs and services we're testing, how important they are and how satisfied they are with the town's delivery. So at a 30,000-foot perspective, when we take a look at satisfaction with the overall level and quality of programs provided by the town of Canmore, 94% of residents this year say that they are satisfied, which is actually an increase numerically from where we were in 2014. Unfortunately, it's just shy of the statistical testing mark, so we can't say that it's statistically significant. So mathematically, I have to stand here and tell you that the numbers are on par with what you had in 2014. But you can see that there's an upward trend from where we were in the previous years. And both of those categories, the very satisfied and the somewhat satisfied categories, are where we saw that growth. In my presentations back in 2014, I spoke a fair bit about performance benchmarking and where to focus, and it is truly about growing that top cohort, the people who are very satisfied or strongly agree with these measurements, and we continue to see that growth in this number and in several others on the subsequent slides. I'm not going to debrief each of these, but what I will show you very quickly, again, there's a series of services. We're showing you the full scale, very important, down to not at all important. And this is the second set of them, is that essentially everything that you do is important to the vast majority of citizens in this community. If we were to draw a virtual line at animal control and bylaw services, 85% of the services before that receive an importance rating higher than 85%. Public art and the Bow Valley Parent Link rate relatively lower because these types of services often have more of a user component and sometimes an ideological component, particularly on art and social programs. But that said, you still have 65% of the population who say that this service is important to them personally. Now, when we take a look at satisfaction scores, for the most part, the measurements have held. So I will draw your attention to a few where we have noted statistical changes, and they're colored. Green being positive, where the number has increased, red being negative, where the number has decreased. So this year we saw an increase from 81% in 2014 to 91% this year for emergency preparedness. We see a similar increase, 12 points for the Bow Valley Parent Link. So while it rates relatively lower in comparison to the other services, we're seeing more people this year saying that they're satisfied with that service, from 56% up to 68%. And there are three service areas where we see significant decreases in citizen satisfaction. They are street cleaning, including snow and ice removal, where the decrease of 11 points from where we were in 2014 to 71. Traffic management, again, a decrease from 70 to 59. And the land use and community planning, a decrease of 8 percentage points from 62 to 54. Now, the vast majority of these measurements, for the most part, when we look at even the internal benchmarking, have held. And we would expect to see, again, varying shifts in some services, but for the most part, that narrative around strong delivery of programs and services has held. And when we take a look at how these services plot, so this is a bit of a pollster eye chart, so I apologize, but the reason that we ask importance and satisfaction is to look at the relationship between them. And so this grid is plotting importance down the vertical axis, satisfaction across the horizontal axis, which means that those things in the upper right-hand corner are things that have high levels of satisfaction and high levels of stated importance among citizens. And that's why we call them your primary strengths, because right now the gap between the importance and satisfaction measurements are quite low. On the other side, we have what we're going to call primary weaknesses. And again, this is a relative exercise, so there's always something that ends up in the primary weakness category. And again, these are still high stated importance, but relatively lower levels of satisfaction compared to the rest of the services tested. And many of the things that are in this quadrant for the town of Canmore are the same things that are in this quadrant for other municipalities. In fact, I could take the town of Canmore's logo off of this particular slide and insert, for the vast majority of my clients, a very similar grid into their presentations, and we'd have the same conversation around land use planning and things related to mobility. So snow removal, sidewalks, traffic flow, all of those things typically in the realm of municipal government are areas where people believe that there's opportunities for improvement. On to everyone's favorite topic, financial planning. So two questions, in this section. The first one relates to value for taxes. And again, we ask people on a 4-point scale. Don't know is an option. The value that they receive for their property tax dollars, again, that number is held this year at over 8 in 10 residents saying that they get good value for the taxes that they pay. On the flip side, we have over 1 in 10, 16%, who say that they get poor value. We do ask in Canmore, and we don't ask this question in other municipalities very often only because of the time constraints that we have, but we do ask people to tell us why they say that they get good value and why they say that they get poor value. We've combined those responses onto one chart, which is why there's a positive and negative net. And the other reason is that some people may have said that they get somewhat good value. And when we asked them why, they gave us a response that was in the negative, that they wish that there was something more being delivered in this particular area. So that's why we've combined them together to ensure that you can see sort of from a full scope perspective how those responses fall out. So among the positive responses, so the majority of those people who said that they get good value for their taxes, again, you can see the responses there. Those who say they get poor value, there's some mentions in there around high cost of living, the economic impact, and some people believe that their taxes are indeed high. Communications. So again, we have assessed this question back to 2012. The number has steadily increased since that time, but we're comparing on this chart just against 2014. This year, almost 9 in 10 residents say that they would rate the overall town communications as being good or very good, with 3 in 10 saying very good. And when we ask them to tell us their top information needs, again, the narrative really hasn't changed from where we were a couple of years ago. So the top mention, community planning, community events, community updates, really the key takeaway from this is that there isn't a silver bullet in terms of communication messaging or topics. That given the breadth of what you provide, there's a desire among citizens to be able to access all of that information whenever they are looking for it. We do ask people their preferred communication method. So the best way for the town to communicate information to them, my colleague, the newspaper people to my right, I'm sure will be very happy that the 57% of residents say that that is their preferred method for information. But however, the town website is number 2. And we see a slight decrease in that area, but we've seen an increase in other digital assets that the town of Canmore is employing. So, you do control the second mention, but right now, residents say that the first place that they're going to go is to the newspaper. This next section looks at customer service. So we look at the percentage of people who say that they have contacted the town in the last 12 months. 57% of residents say that they have contacted the town or one of its employees in the last 12 months. That is a lot of people. That number is down slightly from where we were in 2014, but if you project that onto the population, that's a tremendous amount of people interacting with your administration. And you can see the way that they are doing it, 4 in 10 in person, and almost 4 in 10 by telephone. And this is where you are a bit unique. In more urban centers, where there is a larger call center or larger digital assets, the in-person numbers oftentimes in the 20% range, but in communities such as Canmore and Banff and Red Deer and communities that are a little bit smaller, we tend to see that in-person number significantly higher. We do ask people to tell us why they've interacted with the town. I won't go through this, but the top mention relates to business and licensing services, followed by animal and bylaw. And again, keeping in mind that 57% of people who took this survey said that they interacted with your town staff, administration continues to hold very strong service delivery measurements in terms of maintaining satisfaction levels among the people who are calling. In fact, 8 in 10 say that they're satisfied with over half of those people saying that they are very satisfied with their interactions. Now, not to diminish that there are opportunities for improvement. There are still 17% of respondents who say that they were not satisfied, with over 1 in 10 who say that they are not at all satisfied. So this is by no means a perfect score, but it does continue to highlight that with that type of volume, administration continues to deliver strong service to the public. And finally, related to service delivery, a series of attitudes that we've been tracking over time. I'll let you look at those numbers. Those numbers have not changed significantly between 2014 and 2017 around consistency of service, speed of service, whether or not staff are helpful, courteous, and knowledgeable, can they get a hold of people in time. Where we do see a change, however, is around the idea of open and accessible government. We do see a 7-point decrease from where we were in 2014 down to 79% this year. New for this year, we did ask a question about how good of a job Canmore is doing when it comes to addressing the issue of human-wildlife interaction in the town. Again, this would be one of the measurements that we would flag as an opportunity for improvement down the road. 69% say good, 30% say poor. Again, we don't have any context to be able to describe why, but that's certainly something that we've spoken with administration as an opportunity for perhaps future dialogue with residents. And when we ask people how satisfied they are with the town's programs and services aimed at helping residents reduce their own environmental impacts, again, 8 in 10 say that they're satisfied. This is 7 percentage points, but keep in mind that the margin of error is 7.2, so it was just on the statistical cusp of being a significant shift. So I have to say that the number is on par with where we were last year, but would highlight this as one that's trended down from where we were in previous years, and we did talk about that with administration as well. On the topic of engagement, these were new baseline measurements for 2017. These are questions that we have fielded in other communities and ones that we know that administration will continue to look at over the next 24 months. And again, you can see how those numbers fall out. Over 8 in 10 say that they would like to provide input, down to the very last one. Town's decision-making about projects and services are reflective of the voice of a majority of residents. Just 56% of residents agree with that particular statement. But generally, the sentiments on this slide around how the town engages and people's appetite to engage are quite similar to what we see in other places as well. Very quickly on the website, almost 8 in 10 residents say that they've been there in the last 12 months. The vast majority say that the content is useful. Quickly on community safety, it is not very often. There's always somebody on the phone who will say that will disagree with a certain sentiment. However, it's 100% of those that we spoke to on the phone would rate Canmore as a safe community, being very safe or somewhat safe. Again, we're showing you the percentage decimals there because there were one or two people in the survey who provided a not safe response, and we wanted to make sure that it was clear that those responses had been captured as part of the measurements. We also asked this year what the biggest crime and personal safety issue facing Canmore is. Again, you can see the top mention here is theft and burglary, followed by substance abuse and public intoxication. Again, a very similar list of issues to what we had in 2014. And finally, the last topic relates to growth and development. There were 3 attitudinal statements that we asked people to agree or disagree with as it relates to growth and development. And I'm going to read each one of these. So it's possible for the town of Canmore to grow while maintaining the quality of life that we have come to enjoy in this town. In 2006 and 14, we had 65% of residents agree with that statement. That's down 14 points to 51% for where we are in 2017. The town of Canmore keeps citizens informed about how it plans to deal with growth. That number did not change. 64% this year, 63% in 2014. The town of Canmore does a good job managing the level and growth of development in the town, down 10 points from where we were in 2014 to 51%. And again, I will just reiterate the point that I made earlier around timing, that this these changes in measurements are likely reflective of a mood in the community at the time that we were making these calls. However, there were a number of things that were happening at that time that would have influenced citizen mindsets. So, this is an area where we flagged for administration that we'll look for benchmarking down the road to see whether or not those numbers increase or if they stabilize where they are today. So with that, I will just quickly say in summation that similar to previous years, this continues to be a balanced report card for the town of Canmore. There are areas of strength in terms of meeting the needs related to quality of life, meeting the needs from an overall perspective in terms of delivering programs and services, and certainly hitting the mark in terms of delivering customer service. As I've highlighted throughout the results, there are some areas of opportunity related to service delivery, perhaps communications, and perhaps information and engagement related to growth and development. So with that, I'd like to say thank you for the opportunity to be here, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you very much for being here and going through the survey in such detail, Mr. Duncan. The very last slide you spoke to, not at all surprising, but it's interesting in a way. It's around perceptions regarding growth and development, and it's somewhat, the answer, the information is somewhat similar to that which we got 10 years or so ago when we asked about rabbits. It's a 50-50 thing. Half the people think we should keep rabbits and half think we should not. And what this response is showing is half the people think that the town can continue to grow while maintaining the quality of life, and the other half feel we can't. I don't know what you do with that information, but still it's interesting. I don't know if councillors have any specific questions. I was also intrigued on the one slide. Councillor Presser, are you waiting for around affordable housing, because we have put top priority on that. And you note in the one slide that 9 out of 10 residents place a very high importance on affordable housing. But half of the respondents are not satisfied with what we've been doing. So I would interpret that, and you can correct me if I'm wrong. What I'm hearing is the community thinks it's very important to be dealing with affordable housing, and I choose to read the second chart as suggesting that the community at large would rather see the town doing more for affordable housing.
No, again, I would think I would be hesitant to respond with a sort of a concrete answer to that question, but I will perhaps draw a couple of things in to maybe help contextualize that response. Part of the challenge in a community like Canmore, and similar to other places in Alberta, where a cost of living is deemed to be high, and we heard that in the open-ended responses when we asked people about quality of life and has it changed, has it improved. It's a challenge often to unpack that component of affordable housing from the conversation around, the term social housing, and what people's views and perspectives are on that. The other piece that compounds this year is the economic downturn. And again, we saw quite clearly in these results that there are residents who continue to feel the impact of that economic downturn, and that also impacts how people feel and talk about affordable housing. So my answer is, I think, a non-answer, other than to say that that's one area that perhaps administration may spend some time looking at in more detail. Unfortunately, the survey doesn't have that answer, but I would just bring those other pieces into the mix as well when considering that number, because I believe that there are a few things impacting it just beyond simply the term affordable housing and the context that the town uses it.
Mm-hmm. Unless there's other questions or comments from council. Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Mr. Duncan, for being before us again with all this wonderful information. I'm just noting in your methodology that you did 300 telephone interviews, and at the bottom of that slide on number 4, it says you had 152 individuals complete the online survey?
Yeah, so actually I would like to make a correction to that. It's actually 80.
Sorry?
80 people completed
80?
the online survey. Yeah.
Oh, as opposed to 152?
Yeah.
And you said that the input would be, or the results would be provided separately. Is that reflected in here somehow?
No, so the results, because we run these two opportunities separately, they are being provided to administration tomorrow in a format that is quite similar to this. Okay. And the reason that we've kept them separate is because the approach in our sample of 300 is a scientific approach. It's a probability sample. It's a best practice in terms of ensuring that we get a broad representation of views and perspectives across the community. The online survey was an open link and self-select. So what that means is that I could have chosen to participate while my neighbor could have chosen to not participate. And when we look at the half of the respondents are over the age of 55 years, which is not reflective of your population age distribution. And so that's why we keep those separate. There is a tremendous amount of value and insight in the responses that were provided. So they will be given to administration in their entirety. Our team is just doing a quick scrub to make sure that there's no personal information included in there. Sometimes people accidentally include that. And we will give it to administration and support them as they review it and look at it in the context of these results. What I will say at 30,000 feet, that those results are substantially more negative than this broader representative picture. And in part because many of the respondents who chose to participate in their open-ended responses cited disagreements related to growth and development.
Okay,
yeah.
So the survey results you're showing before us today are random samples, and so they're not very specifically about those particular issues?
Correct.
Because you went out to the community to get that information as opposed to people writing in with certain perspectives.
Correct. And so a probability sample means that if we were to replicate this over and over again, 19 times out of 20, we would get the same result within that 7-point swing. And that's the methodology that, in terms of best practice for municipal work, is certainly the one that we have seen across the country.
Okay. And my other question was the demographic information that you provided.
Mm-hmm.
We didn't really go over that in your presentation, but how did you come to those numbers? They
are provided to us by the respondents on the phone.
Okay.
So the results are weighted by age and gender.
Mm-hmm.
To reflect the last census update that we had to be able to weight the data to be representative. But we are at the mercy of our respondents to provide the demographic information that's in there. So it's meant to give you a profile of the people who have responded to the survey.
And so this isn't the same demographic information you would find in the census then, the percentage-wise?
I believe that you would have had a municipal census that was perhaps more up to date.
Okay, so it's not reflective of that. This is from your telephone survey and extrapolated from your 300 people.
Yep.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Councillor Krauser.
Thank you, Your Worship. Mr. Duncan, just to clarify with the difference between the survey that was done and the open link, just so I understand correctly, the open link, those represent the views of those individuals, but because it's not scientifically reliable, we shouldn't be relying upon that as being a view of the community as a whole, because there's too many other factors that could be involved. There's the choice to participate or not. You could encourage a group. We've seen this in other studies of what type of facilities do you want in town. And you get a group that's very active and they can promote it to their friends, and then you see this larger representation of a particular viewpoint, whereas a random survey, it wouldn't reflect that. Am I capturing that correctly?
You are. What I would say is that the survey results that I presented today, conducted through the telephone methodology, is one that you can project and extrapolate to the broad population in Canmore. The online survey, again, self-select. So not to diminish those responses, they're important context, but they are not representative.
Yeah. They're the views of those individuals.
Of those who participated. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Are there comments, questions from council? Seeing none, thanks again very much, Mr. Duncan.
Thank you very much.
For being here. That I'll move on to item C1, the minutes of the June 20th regular meeting of council. There errors or omissions? Seeing none, I'll move they be adopted as presented. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Looking then to the minutes of the public hearing, Wednesday, June 21st. Are there errors or omissions? Seeing none, I'll move they be adopted as presented. Okay. And, pardon me? Minutes of June 21st, public hearing. Errors or omissions? Seeing none, I'll move they be adopted as presented. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried. Moving then to item F1, the CCHC Construction Loan Guarantee Bylaw 2017-31. Mr. Fark.
Good evening, Mayor Morban, members of council. I'm sure glad that the weather outside is terrible so that we can all be enjoying our evening session here. So, the matter before you presently is the CCHC Construction Loan Guarantee Bylaw, and this may seem familiar to you as you have previously approved a loan guarantee bylaw for CCHC. In fact, on April 4th of 2017, you gave first reading to the bylaw, 2017-23, and on May 16th, 2017, you gave it second and third reading. Within 30 days of you providing third reading to that bylaw, a review or application for judicial review was filed with the Court of Queen's Bench, and the MGA sets out that a bylaw does not become valid if a judicial review has been launched within that period of time. However, that's not the only reason why we are here this evening. So, and I'm going to take my time with this because there are a number of elements. So, when the judicial review was brought to our attention, the town had a number of options available to us in terms of how we chose to respond. In this particular case, it is always the prerogative of council to update, to clarify, or to enhance a bylaw that it has already passed. And in this particular case, it was deemed that we could take the opportunity to update and enhance the existing bylaw rather than waste the court's time and taxpayer money fighting a judicial review process whose intent was to delay the project. And the intent to delay the project was a matter of public record based on a statement made by the applicant. So rather than pursue that path, administration is bringing the bylaw back. Our recommendation is that we repeal the previous version of the bylaw and replace it with a updated version of the bylaw that includes some enhancements and clarifications. Although administration does not believe that, or I guess put another way, the original bylaw was perfectly serviceable. It met, in the opinion of administration, the requirements of the MGA and the intent for which it was passed. So amending the bylaw is not necessary, but as I indicated, it is certainly the prerogative of council to update and to enhance a bylaw when opportunity suits them. I won't go into it further because I believe that you are well familiar with the bylaw and its contents and its intent, which is to guarantee the loan for the CCHC housing development on the old daycare lands parcel. You are familiar with the amount of money for which the loan guarantee is. It is present in the staff report and capped to a maximum. What I will point out is the more substantive changes to the bylaw. So the first one is the inclusion of the interest rate. So the MGA sets out a requirement that for a loan guaranteeing bylaw, you must either provide the interest rate or the method of interest rate calculation. So in the previous iteration, we provided the interest rate method of calculation, and that was done in discussion with CCHC and the bank at their request. In this particular case, we have had opportunity to have further discussions with CCHC and with the bank is quite happy to make publicly available the actual interest rate. So that is included in the bylaw, and that is prime plus 0.4%, or the banker's acceptance rate, whichever is deemed more advantageous to CCHC at the time that the guarantee comes into effect. The second rather important update to the bylaw is we have included a security interest in favor of the town. This is a belt and suspenders type of initiative. The town is a sole shareholder of CCHC. We have an interest, therefore, in what they do by definition. However, including the security interest in favor of the town essentially would clarify what the process would look like should a receivership ever occur with this particular parcel. Now, given that this is a municipality-backed project, a receivership is extremely unlikely, but this is again, sort of an administrative cleanup, a belt and suspenders addition that other minor wording amendments were done to update and to enhance the bylaw. What I would add is that in terms of an alternative analysis, as I indicated, there is a serviceable bylaw in place. Council could opt to not pass first reading of this and continue to pursue the original bylaw. Administration advises against that for two reasons. The first one is that we do believe that the changes to the bylaw do provide some enhancements and clarity for the community and for CCHC and the town, so there is benefit in that. And as I indicated earlier, the second reason is that a judicial review process can be complicated and protracted and very costly. It's costly to taxpayer dollars, and it is a significant burden on the time of the court. And we don't feel that it is in the benefit of the court or the town to pursue that, and we can move forward in this way without incurring significant delays on the project. So for that reason, we are recommending that you repeal the existing and replace it with the new bylaw 2017-31. With that, I will answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Fark. And it's not required to have a second separate motion to repeal the previous bylaw, as I see that's a section within bylaw 2017-31 that it would repeal the previous bylaw?
That is correct. So the repeal of the bylaw, the existing bylaw, and the replacement with a new bylaw occurs all within one bylaw. The same notice period and advertisement requirements therefore apply to both, so that the public has plenty of opportunity to be aware of both.
And following the process with this bylaw, it would be the middle of September that we would then have valid bylaw if there's no additional appeal made to the Court of Queen's Bench?
That is correct.
Thank you. Councillor Krausert?
Your Worship, a couple of things. Can you first of all speak to bankers' acceptance rate?
Okay. So the bankers' acceptance rate is a term of art used within the banking industry to indicate a particular rate available at a given time. They're also sometimes referred to as stamp rates, and they are usually available through the bank's website or through their commercial banking arms. And so it is a number that is known at any given time. So I could call the Bank of Nova Scotia today and say, what is your bankers' acceptance rate for today? And they would be able to provide me that information.
So just like prime rate, it's another one that's...
That's right. It's similar to that.
Perfect. And just to clarify, there is land use on that land already approved. This goes to provide a guarantee, but it is ultimately up to the bank to decide when they, if they wanted to issue funds before this came into full effect or not, right?
So the judicial review only relates to the loan guarantee bylaw. That's the only thing that is impugned or held up. The land use remains in place. The project can go ahead through other means of financing. The bank can opt to provide the financing in absence of the loan guarantee. Right. All of those things are possible, yes.
Perfect, thank you.
Councillor Russell?
I think this is easy.
I hope
We've
so.
covered all the bases. We're good. No surprises lurking for us.
So the reality of the court system is that there's always an opportunity for somebody to come along and launch a challenge. The success of that challenge is weighed on the merits of the basis of the challenge. Administration was confident in the validity of the existing bylaw. We are equally confident should we need to defend the updated bylaw and our success in being able to do that. In this particular case, like I said, rather than having to go through that expensive process, it seemed more logical to do some other updates and enhancements to the bylaw and move forward in this way as being more expedient. So I guess the short answer to your question, Councillor Russell, is yes, we believe that we are on very solid ground. That's not to say that that prevents somebody from taking an action that we cannot anticipate.
I think I get it. Thank you.
Are there other questions at this time from members of council? Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Mr. Fark, for your presentation. So am I to understand that once they sell 1/3 of the properties, that our commitment to the debt, or 1/3 of the value in the amount of $5,645,000, once that amount is sold, then we don't have any liability toward that debt?
No, that's not correct. So the loan guarantee is a percentage of the total loan provided by the bank to CCHC. We are providing 35% of that loan. So until the bank loan is entirely repaid, or until September 30th of 2019, the loan guarantee remains in effect. And the reason for that is because, let's say we sold 1/3 or 1/2 of the units, CCHC sold 1/3 or 1/2 of the units, and then went into the receivership. The bank would still be on the hook for the balance, and the loan guarantee would still be in play. So it's not sufficient just to recover enough to cover the cost of the loan guarantee. The point of the loan guarantee is to provide the bank the confidence that they will recover the full amount required that they have loaned.
Okay, and so September 30th, 2019, how is that relevant to?
It's relevant because this is a loan guarantee for a construction project. And as such, there is an expectation of a development process. So this is not a mortgage, it's a construction loan. And therefore, the construction, the period of time during which the loan is in force and the guarantee is in force is time limited. And this is something that the bank has understands and is in agreement with.
And is the construction expected to be completed by September 30th, 2019?
Yes, long before then.
Substantial, okay. In the event of a judicial review, has the town currently incurred costs for that?
Yes, so the town has incurred costs. We were required to retain legal counsel to respond to the judicial review application. We have sought legal advice in terms of what is the best way to move forward, and we have drafted a consent to dismissal for the judicial review, given that we are repealing the bylaw in question, and we have provided that to the applicant, and now we are prepared to move forward from there.
And is the town expected to pay costs for the applicants?
No. So the way a judicial review application works is that if it comes to, you actually go to court, the court generally will rule that the cost is in the cause. And so what that means is that if whichever side is ultimately successful, they can make an application to the court and they can request some reimbursement of costs. And there is a formula that the court sets out that clearly determines what costs are eligible and what costs are not. So first, the applicant would have to be successful. Then they would have to be successful in convincing the court that they should be awarded costs. And then the costs that would be awarded would be limited to what is set out in the formula. So there is certainly no obligation on the part of the town to provide costs.
Okay. I did have one more question. When we advertise these bylaws, generally what people do if they want to petition, they would have to have a successful petition with a number of names on it?
Yes. So what the MGA sets out is that if you are in opposition to the bylaw itself, then your recourse, the manner of public input is you can make submissions to council, or you can provide a petition. In order for the petition to carry weight, it has to amass a certain number of signatures in order to achieve sufficiency. So that would be how the MGA sets out that you should express opposition to the intent of the bylaw.
Okay. And that's usually the process that we've been accustomed to hearing.
Yes.
So that's generally how people do it.
That is, yes. Okay. In this particular case, again, based on statements made in the newspaper, it is the position of administration that a judicial review was taken as the option, as the best opportunity to cause delay, as opposed to necessarily, or put another way, the opposition is to the project, not to the bylaw necessarily itself.
Okay, thank you very much.
Are there other questions from members of council at this time? Seeing none, thanks for your report, Mr. Fark. That I will move the council give first reading in the Canmore Community Housing Corporation Construction Loan Guarantee Bylaw 2017-31. So discussion on the motion. Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor, opposed, motion's carried unanimously. Moving on to item F2, Bylaw 2017-25, amendments to the R2A SC Land Use District. Mr. Fish.
Good evening, Your Worship and members of council. Sorry, if you bear with me for just one moment, I will just remove Mr. Fark's presentation and put in my own brief presentation. All right, briefly, Bylaw 2017-25 is the amendment to the R2A SC district, as well as proposed rezoning for 2 lots. So, as I just mentioned, there are 2 pieces. One is to amend the R2A SC district, the light green area shown. A second component at first reading and discussed at the public hearing was to rezone 2 parcels, lot 27 and 28, both an MR and a standard lot, both the orange and the green area shown on the air photo here. As discussed at the public hearing, administration is proposing to not proceed with the rezoning of those 2 lots, pending further discussions and land transfer of the owner of lot 27, as well as the land disposition process that is underway on, the MR disposition process underway on lot 28 MR. And we have a public hearing scheduled for, I believe it is August 22nd to consider that. I have mentioned this briefly at first reading and at the public hearing. I won't go into detail here. The applicant as well spoke during the public hearing to provide a little bit more detail. So basically we're including a comprehensively designed concept for the entire district, or for almost the entire district. And with that, there are some nuances that it allows detached garden suites, allows duplex dwellings to have suites, and allows detached front yard garages with some design specific requirements. During the applicant's presentation, I was looking at the conceptual drawings that they were showing for the entry-level units that are potentially going to be associated with the garage units, and became concerned that it could be interpreted that the garden suite associated with those would only have a lower 6.5 meter height building, and that's clearly not the intent in what we see in the diagram on the left here. So where there was potentially a roof, and so that allows a full story. That makes those units quite a bit more livable and functional. Our garden suite bylaw is generally limited to 50 square meters or just over 500 square feet. So it's quite small, and I don't think that's in line with the intent necessarily of the entry-level units. So I've proposed a slight amendment since the public hearing, just to clarify that garden suites associated with comprehensive multifamily developments would be also allowed to go to the 10.5 meter height limit. However, where they are proposed with a detached front yard garage, they would have the maximum building height of 6.5. So it's a somewhat editorial change. It's consistent with the intent of the applicant, and they had no concerns with the proposed changes. It just brings clarity, hopefully, for the landowner in the future and development planners processing applications in the future. So with that amendment highlighted in gray, the recommendation is that Council give second and third reading to Bylaw 2017-25 as amended, and that amendment does include the removal of the 2 lots that had been proposed for the rezoning. I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Fish. Discussed this quite a bit at first reading and then public hearing. I don't have a lot of questions myself. Just to be clear, though, the wording within the bylaw around the land use district around the entry-level units above the garages, it's clearly only intended to apply to this particular district at this time.
That's correct, yes.
And if looking forward, if it should prove successful at providing entry-level housing, it would be something the town might in the future consider in other districts. Arguably.
Perhaps.
Yeah. Other questions for Mr. Fish? Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Worship. So is that amendment to the height, is that more or less a visual, cosmetic type of thing to make it fit better into this land?
Yes, overall, it would be possible to build a townhouse unit that would have the 10.5 meter height across the entire area. So
then you would have,
what is unusual about this is that it sort of splits it from a single larger building with different units within it into potentially a duplex unit at the front with the detached garages at the back with the entry level above. So it's just a change in how the Lego blocks are kind of put together on the site. But under the previous zoning, prior to considering any of this, you could have a townhouse development in this area here that would be entirely attached with the 3 units built in, and that would fit the definition of the built form. So it's again, if we think about it, and this drawing is illustrative of the Lego block analogy, it's just separating the Lego blocks rather than keeping them all together. So it just allows for some clarity around that, but doesn't penalize the proponent for having a potentially interpreted 6.5 meter building height for the garage suite.
okay, so from our perspective, what is the benefit to us from that?
It enables a more creative approach to providing the entry-level units that are not currently allowed in the bylaw through one interpretation of the uses.
Okay, good, because I did notice that that amendment that you proposed, and I wanted to see the image of that, so I think you've explained it. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Mr. Fish, in the proposed amendment on 2.22.8.4, which is referencing possibility of variance, the wording strikes me as something that, I mean, that's wording that's similar to a number of other land use districts, the possibility of 10% additional roof area exceeding the maximum building height by up to 10%. That's a discretion that's allowed within a number of land use districts.
Yes, that's correct. The critical qualifier here is the slope adaptive design. And so the site, as the proponent spoke about, it's somewhat challenging because of how the site slopes within a relatively small area. So that results in some interpretations of, as you can see it here, the 10.5 meter building height, particularly in the bottom right illustration. You can see where it could be that the building in one small corner would poke above the 10.5. It's not what's illustrated there, but you can see how it would be easy for that to happen. And so this would allow 10% of the entire roof area, essentially a small portion of the roof peak, to extend above that 10.5 meters. And yes, that is not in all districts throughout the town, but it's in a number of districts.
And is the planning approval or approving authority that has that discretion?
That's correct.
Right. Are there other questions at this time from members of council? Seeing none, thank you for your report, Mr. Fish. Councillor Comfort.
I'm just informing the chair and council that I can't vote on this issue because I was not able to attend the public hearing due to a car accident earlier in the day, so I will sit quiet.
Thanks. So the minutes will reflect that. Pardon me?
To recuse yourself.
Recuse yourself.
No? No?
No.
Oh, okay, sorry.
As long as she doesn't take part in the discussion or vote, which you won't. That then I'll move the council give second reading to bylaw 2017-25 R2A-SC residential family low density district Stewart Creek as amended. There's discussion on the motion. I'll speak very briefly to it. I continue to be in support of this land use. We've tried over the last 20 or 30 years in different ways to provide entry-level housing, and we haven't been terribly successful at that. It's a creative approach to hopefully providing something that really is entry-level. It's in a neighborhood that it's not developed yet, so it seems like a good opportunity to try something a little different. Lord knows we need to do more about creating housing that people can afford in this town. So for that reason, I'll support second reading. So other discussion on the motion? See none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. And I'll then move that council give third reading to bylaw 2017-25 R2A-SC, the residential family low density district, Stewart Creek, as amended. Discussion on the motion. See none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. Moving on then to item F3. Land Use Bylaw Amendment 2017-28, political campaign signs locations. Ms. Hyde.
Thank you, Mayor and Council. I'm here tonight to speak about proposed land use bylaw amendment 2017-28, political campaign sign locations. This bylaw amendment was brought forward by administration in response to council direction to look at prohibiting or limiting campaign signs on public property. Council held a public hearing on June 21st, and we received a total of 12 submissions. 8 were in favor of some type of restriction, and 4 were in opposition to restrictions. This map represents the locations that we're talking about. 5 locations were proposed. And I would just like to point out, there was one question at the public hearing about whether or not the land use bylaw applied to public land, and it does not, or I mean, sorry, to provincial land, and it does not. So if we look at Three Sisters, scroll down, Three Sisters Parkway, is a provincial roadway, as is Highway 1A. So the only sections of land that the bylaw, the land use bylaw now, and the amendment would apply to are municipal land, which we've estimated for the purposes of this meeting. This map doesn't form a part of the bylaw, but it's roughly, the municipal land is roughly the areas outlined in purple at those intersections. So we can just see it. Sorry, it's not working very well. So at Elk Run Boulevard, then at on the way up to the Nordic Center, and then down here at Three Sisters. So that represents where the signs would be permitted within that 50-meter distance that was amended into the bylaw at first reading. So the one part two about the 50-meter distance works at the corners except for here, which the T intersection, sorry, can you see this mouse? The T intersection is here where you come out of the road. So the municipal land only goes in one direction. So it would have to be within 50 meters of the center of the T intersection, which really only goes one way. So I hope that's clear. You can ask any questions if you have any, and I'll do my best to answer them. So I have to admit, when I was writing this report and making a recommendation, I did struggle to come up with a recommendation, really. The proposed restrictions were an effort to compromise between two pretty disparate views. There's people who feel quite strongly on either side of the issue. And you know, even though there's only a few people at the public hearing, the people in favor of the bylaw seem to accept that a compromise might work for them, but people opposed to the bylaw did not speak to a compromise working in any way for them at all. So I don't know, I don't feel like the bylaw limiting locations really does satisfy a number of opposing people on this issue. So in the end, we sort of came to the conclusion that the current practices are relatively harmless, and that restrictions still likely won't please a lot of people who are hoping for something more. And at the same time, it adds a level of bureaucracy to something that's pretty straightforward right now. So for that reason, administration did recommend that council defeat the bylaw at second reading. And I think that's it. That's all I had to say. That's the end of my presentation. Happy to entertain any questions.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. So Ms. Hyde, back to the provincial lands piece, which is new information, I think, for all of us today. Or at least Friday when we got our agenda package. Yeah. So what you're saying is that the land use bylaw in any way, shape, or form does not apply to those provincial lands?
No.
So our half a meter square size sign does not apply. People can put up whatever they want on those public lands because currently there is no, on those
on the provincial
lands, because currently there's actually no rules in play from the provincial government.
No, the province doesn't allow them.
So they don't allow
the province doesn't allow signs. No, but for what I understand is that they don't often remove them. I think they sometimes do. I was talking to our Streets and Roads department, and he said that he's seen them remove them once or twice. He said, but mostly they seem to, they're only up temporarily. It sort of seems that it's not enforced by the province.
Sorry, I thought for a moment there that it was saying that like the land use bylaw did not apply to them at all, and that the province was silent on what was going on there. Which
the province doesn't permit the signs. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
No other questions for Ms. Hyde? Seeing none, thanks very much for the work you've done on this.
Thank you.
So this time I will move that council gives second reading to Land Use Bylaw Amendment 2017-28, political campaign signs location as amended. Councillor McCallum.
I would like to propose a motion to postpone this item.
Okay.
And I'd like to speak to it. So the motion is to postpone this decision until May 28th of 2018. So after this election, next coming election. So as some around the council table may remember, the idea of having a community discussion about this topic was one that came up not long after the 2013 election. In fact, in July of 2014, there had been so much community discussion on the topic that I'd been invited to speak about my perspective on the local radio. At that time, the planning department thought that they would be able to address this in the next year. Fast forward 3 years, and it's finally come to council. During the public hearing, we had a range of input and questions, some of which I could have answered for presenters on the spot. But as we know, it is a public hearing, not a public hearing and answer. And I heard more questions from the public submissions on how this change would play out in real time. So we see this clearly in the staff report about how to make it happen. How are we actually going to make this happen in real time when the boots hit the ground with the provincial issues, et cetera. But in my opinion, immediately voting in the negative is not the best way to respond to more questions, because what I heard was that more time was required to answer those questions. So let us talk more about time, and in particular, timing. Due to the impending election, there is citizenry out there that are eyeing suspiciously at the date of this proposed change. And to sit and think, I can truly understand why they would feel that way. It is clear to me that the timing is wrong, and I will take responsibility for my part in that. Just like council should not be seen to set the rate of pay for the term in which they are serving, those same councils should not be seen to be drastically changing the terms of campaigning when they are mere months away from an election. I can understand their concern, and again, I apologize. Therefore, I am proposing that council postpone the above motion and have it returned to this table by the May 28th, 2018 council meeting to be addressed by that council. It is my expectation that the 2017 campaign will still be fresh in the public's mind at that time, that administration will have further time to explore the questions that came from this process and be able to provide additional answers, and that the community will have the opportunity to have real conversations amongst themselves and with that council about their feelings on this topic without worrying that something, quote, darker is at play, unquote. I thank council for taking the time to listen to me, and I encourage you all to support the motion to postpone.
Thank you, Councillor. Just the proposed date, the May 28th, is 4th. May 28th, 2018. Is that a Tuesday?
It is, and it could come any Tuesday before the 28th of May.
So the motion is postponed to that meeting, but it's a friendly amendment to postpone till a meeting before May 28th, because there may not be a meeting.
That's kind of what I was implying, sorry.
Okay.
That's fuzzy.
Ms. DeSoto?
You were anticipating. Yes, Your Worship, and just for council's consideration, I'm not sure that we can postpone second and third reading to a new council, given that we'd likely have to have a new public hearing, given that it's a new council. So I am understanding what Councillor McCallum is intending, but I'm not sure procedurally it can be done.
That's too bad, because I spent 20 minutes on the clerk with this afternoon about this topic, so I was kind of hoping some backup here.
Yeah, we went, I'm just remembering now that you say that, we went through that with the Bow Valley Trail ARP, didn't we? Would have to be a second public hearing.
Yeah.
Which may not be a bad thing. May not be a bad thing, then that will allow community to give input immediately after an election and fresh in their minds what the effect is. Councillor Kraushout?
Thank you, Your Worship. Just a technical matter. I believe that this has to also state a reason for the postponement, according to our own procedural bylaw. And so what I'm hearing is that it's to avoid perceptions that this would interfere with the upcoming election or something to that effect. But I think wording to that effect should be in this postponement in order to be aligned with our procedural bylaw.
Okay, so that's another friendly amendment. Yeah. So then this postponing motion that council understands would require a public hearing to come to pass. Council, knowing that, could vote for the postponement, understand there'd be another public hearing for the new council, or could vote to defeat the postponing motion, and we're back to giving second reading to the bylaw. Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Worship. Well, I don't believe that I can support the postponement. I think administration has done an admirable and thorough job of this already. They've presented with us a number of alternatives and information, and in their own words, it seems to be at worst harmless and at best possibly an effective tool for raising awareness about elections. So, you know, to postpone a big conversation like this when we've already had a big conversation like this, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. So I won't propose the amendment or the motion to postpone.
I'll support the postponing motion only because what really side-railed the conversation was the perception that current councillors were hoping to skew the process in some way. I've always spoken clearly that as a resident, I've never really liked the plethora of campaign signs. I'm not going to lose sleep over it if we continue using signs, but I think it would be something for the new council to discuss after an election, and that current challenge is off the table. But I'll support the postponing motion for that reason. Councillor Cressert.
Thank you, Your Worship. Yeah, I'm inclined to support the postponement motion on the argument that it is the best time to consider this issue would be in the period following an election and not the period immediately prior to an election. A lot of the issues raised, I think, can be better spoken to at that time, since that discussion is now going and people will be watching and taking into account what they see, knowing that this is a conversation that's ongoing. From my personal perspective, I know that signs are reused. I know that the cost is actually not formidable, and I know there's a variety of opinions out there. But I would like to hear that and see that in the context of not an election right upon us. So if this is not supported, then I'll have to decide whether I support the other motion or not, or the bylaw or not, but I will support this postponing motion.
Councillor Seeley.
Thank you, Your Worship. I won't be able to support this postponement. I do think we have enough information, and I echo Councillor Sanford's thoughts. Administration put a lot in here. We have some good information, and I think it does interfere with the political process. It's very difficult to run, and I think you want the best council to run, and it encourages candidates, and so to postpone something, it can come up again if it needs to for the next council, but postponing this doesn't make sense to me.
Councillor Comfort.
I also will support this motion. I believe that Councillor McCallum's intent was always to have this discussion much closer to the conclusion of the previous election, and so this just reflects that intent. I also think that it's indeed better to have this conversation after the fact, and when you have some more data from the election that's just passed and more public perceptions, so the public hearing is a good thing. It's just the continuation of that conversation, and it's a more appropriate time to have this take place. So I will support this motion and thank Councillor McCallum for bringing it forward.
Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Your Worship. First, a question to Municipal Clerk. Which motion is it that we're not supposed to be debating? Is a motion to postpone correct to be debating through Roberts?
Yeah, it's in our, exactly. It's in our procedural bylaw, and a motion to postpone is debatable.
Thank you for that. I appreciate the clarification. I can't support it. Sorry, it's just let the vote go on the motion put forward by, not voting for this. And I think admin did a fine job presenting it.
Did you have another question?
Sure.
Do you have something else? Further discussion on the postponing motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor of the postponement? All opposed? Motion's carried with Councillors Russell, Sanford, and Seeley in opposition. And perhaps I'll call a short break this time before we get into item G1, which may take more than 10 minutes. So short break, 10 minutes. And we're moving on to item G1, the request to amend capital budget for project 1707, planning and development tracking system. Mr. Bring it back.
Good evening, Your Worship, members of council. As you know, I'm here tonight to request additional funding for capital project 1707 in the amount of $180,000. This is to implement a permit and tracking system for planning and development and be funded from the General Capital Reserve. Although I'm presenting to you as Supervisor IT, this is a joint project with the Planning Department, and through my presentation and to answer some of your questions, I may call upon Mr. Fish to assist me with this. Here, yes, there he is. So first off, a little background. As you're aware, planning items and issues are frequently brought to council and other public committees such as Subdivision Appeal Board and Canmore Planning Commission. Well, the system we're talking about tonight is not directly linked to many of these larger topics that come before council. It does provide a direct support for functions of planning that are required by legislation. In effect, having the tracking system that provides a high level of functionality would permit planning staff to focus more on the larger issues that do come before council. So the type of system we're talking about not only applies to applications and permits for building and development, but also contains information about land zoning, subdivision, land usage, and ownership. Another important function of the system is to track fees and payment revenue, which covers the cost of processing applications. So as of today, the Planning Department is using a system called LDO for Land Data Office, which was implemented in partnership with the town of Banff in 2005 and funded through an intermunicipal grant from the province. LDO has been unsupported for a great number of years. It's really badly outdated, and staff in both planning and IT have had to make significant efforts in order to keep this system running and functional to the point where it's valuable to the operations. It was initially recognized that it would require replacement in 2012, but other organizational priorities have delayed bringing this forward and brought it forward in the budget process for 2017. We had worked with a vendor in 2014 to develop the $150,000 budget for this project and brought this forward through the years to 2017 budget, where it received council approval. The project would not only replace the basic functionality of LDO, but also add online services for applications and permits at a minimum. Working with planning earlier this year in the spring, we issued an RFP for a municipal permit and application tracking system. We received responses from a total of 6 vendors, but it became apparent in the review process that systems from 2 vendors were really the only 2 solutions that would provide value to the town in replacing LDO. However, both of these systems were well over the budget, the original budget of $150,000, and that budget would be insufficient to implement a system that would meet the scope and requirements of the project. Although some responses were within the although some responses were received that were within the available budget, these were determined to offer no more functionality than what we currently have in LDO, and given the capital cost and considerable staff time and effort of implementation, the town would really receive little to no benefit for all of this work and cost. And finally, our recent experiences with implementing systems for the Recreation Department and a recreation management system, and human resources for a payroll and HR management system have taught us not to underestimate the requirements of staff time on a system implementation. Given the current priorities and workload in planning, we have allowed for a term position to backfill an experienced staff member from the Planning Department who would be dedicated to the implementation of this project. We've taken a look at this project from several angles. We've engaged the vendors in conversations aimed at reducing costs, and we've shortlisted the RFP to the 2 vendors that we felt met the scope. Both of those proposals are within the cost range of what's being discussed tonight. So initially it was felt best to cancel the project in 2017 and resubmit the project for the next capital budget year with sufficient funding to fully implement the system. However, given the project has been delayed already for several years, and the system that is just functional is being used daily in planning's operations, it was considered important to bring this forward in order to continue the process and try to get the implementation started this year. So in conclusion, we're asking that Council approve the funding for this project so we can proceed with the implementation of a fully functional system this year. And any of you know me, know I have a little bit of a rural background and often refer to things that I learned growing up on the prairie and saying things like, anything worth doing is worth doing well. So the recommendation is that Council increase the budget for Capital Project 1707, Planning and Development Tracking System by $180,000 for a total amount of $330,000, with the additional amount funded from the General Capital Reserve. And with that, I'll take your questions.
Thank you. And do you honestly think it's only on the prairies that people say that? I remember saying that growing up in the city. May we? Councillor Comfort?
Yeah, so I have a couple of questions. You noted in the presentation that Banff had been a partner in the original system, in the LDO.
Correct.
What's Banff doing now?
I can't speak to Banff's processes at this time. I do know that they abandoned LDO at least 10 years ago.
Oh.
Yes.
And we weren't talking then, were we? No.
We were. We just decided we needed the functionality, and they decided they didn't.
Okay. Are there any similar sorts of opportunities to partner with another municipality in replacing our system, or are we so far behind that?
There could be. I think you've identified it right there, though, that many of these municipalities already have one of the two systems that we've shortlisted to.
Okay.
We're finding them both quite prevalent.
And if I may, Your Worship, I have another question. So would a system like this then prevent the kind of error we saw for the zoning of 990 Wilson Way, or so that it would actually keep track of things that, say, went into land use at the provincial level, and would somehow keep track of that and make sure that those are flagged?
I'm going to ask Mr. Fish's assistance here. I'm going to first say that the system that we would implement would make daily or monthly download of information from Alberta Register, the Alberta LTLS, is that the right system?
Oh, okay. And
bring that into our system so we'd have that land information. But I'll let Mr. Fish address that fully.
No.
You're kidding. So
I can elaborate on it, but the short answer is no.
No, you don't have to elaborate.
Okay.
I was hoping for some kind of fail-safe, but you're saying not. Okay.
As long as Mr. Fish is standing there, could you just walk me through the use of this software on a sort of day-to-day basis in your department? I mean,
yes. Yeah. So the majority of use is for managing building and development permits. So if you come in to build a garage, you are entered into the system. We have all your contact information. We're increasingly submitting digital applications. Many other municipalities are accepting digital applications online, so you don't even need to come to the town office. And then increasing levels of automation through the review process are happening. So LDO, although it had some capacity for this, it was not, we couldn't make it work within our system. So it starts the review process whereby applicants can find out information on where their application is at rather than having to call the front desk, find out who's managing their permit, and then forward the call on to them. There's the potential that we may, in a couple of years, be able to see all of that online. So then it's sort of the file location, where it's at through the review process. If planning is reviewing it, engineering, building inspector, safety codes officer, and then once the permit is issued, it then has the potential to manage building inspections and again create a database of information related to that. More important, well, I guess not more importantly, but related to that is when people come to get information about use on a property, right away we can see the history of use. In the past, we had to go through paper files in the filing room. Increasingly, we can get a lot of that information right from the computer, right there. So maintaining that data integrity is a fundamental piece to the project. And LDO has been doing that, but increasingly it's kind of like an HVAC system on a building that is teetering on the brink of not functioning any longer, such that the program will be effectively unusable, potentially.
Okay, so a couple of questions then. So the LDO program, would that be something that would effectively either improve or simply allow us to be effective in sharing that sort of data openly online, and open, what do they call it, an open data source like the GIS that
yeah,
CRP
it's
was
slightly
doing?
different, but it would make our permit data more transparent. So for a while we were able to customize some of that so you could see what building permits or development permits were active in your area, adjacent to your neighborhood or anywhere in town.
So you can go online and see that sort of information in a way similar to the ability for anybody to go online and see what the assessment is of any given piece of property.
We actually already have that as a recent piece.
So this data through LDO would be that accessible as...
That's right. Yes, this would potentially feed into that system or a related system.
And if we were total and complete Luddites and wanted to not use the benefit of modern technology, and somebody was going to manually enter all this information into a spreadsheet or something.
That's exactly it. So our data pre-2006 is a spreadsheet. So it's a Control F in an Excel spreadsheet. Beyond that, it's a matter of going through the files. For about 10 years, we had the Excel spreadsheet, and then before that, it's just a matter of going through the files and trying to see what paper copies are left in files.
And I guess a question for Mr. Ringenbach. If we're going to ask, or curious about what the annualized cost might be of the program. So it's got a short shelf life, the program itself, or how long would we expect to get out of LDO?
The LDO system that we currently have.
Well, the new system. Say.
The new system. Reasonable expectation for line of business software is 10-year implementation.
10 year. We didn't get that out of the first bit of software, the LDO. Did we?
Yes, yeah. Yes. We've implemented in 2005, so we've got 12 years out of it.
Okay, but we haven't been happy with it for 5 years.
Quite some time.
Right, so we would have replaced it 5 years ago if we could have.
Yes.
So say it's 10 years, the cost of $330,000, so it's $33,000 a year annualized. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
There are additional support costs that go along with it. Like most software packages, there's an initial licensing fee, and then there's a software maintenance fee that comes along with that. Usually the software maintenance fees are 15 to 20% of the value of the software. In this case, it'd be around $24,000 annually.
And this may fall, no, I won't go there. Councillor Krauser.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, gentlemen. I'm not sure if it's yourself or somebody else in administration that might be able to help me out. One of the things that I'm going to be interested in going forward as a result of discussions we've had around finances and use of capital reserves and whatnot is trying to understand, when we get asked questions like this, is what are we not doing because we're using the money from general capital reserve for this as opposed to something else. So what impact will using $180,000 from general capital reserve have on other projects or other plans in the works?
Mr. Soto?
That is an excellent question, Councillor Krausert, and one I believe in the discussion with the long-term financial strategy that we've recently had, we really do need to be questioning. And so we did have some difficult questions within administration before bringing this report forward. one option would be to postpone this decision till a later date, and I believe that's identified in the alternatives, and allow it to be considered in light of all of the other budget priorities that come forward at budget time. This was a priority that was brought forward at budget time, and had we known the costs back then, administration would have recommended proceeding with the project, and I think that was the answer that we needed to come to in order to agree to allow this item to come forward. But really we are hoping as we move forward that we do ask those high-level questions of, what are the priorities of the community and where should these funds be spent, and in an efficient and effective planning and development system, I think is one of the fundamental services that we deliver, and it's worthy of ensuring that we can continue to do that in the best way possible.
So just to follow up question then, is there a middle alternative rather than canceling an RFP and putting it to the next budget time? Is it, what would be the impact of having this come back to the next council meeting? Granted, I recognize that's not till August, in order to have some analysis of that done and presented to us. Is that something that might be a good alternative, or is that not recommended?
If I could potentially weigh in, and sorry, Councillor Cussler, to your previous question. So if I'm channeling my inner manager of finance, what she would be saying is it represents an opportunity cost. So we have the general capital reserve currently, and that number currently sits at a little over 8 million, I believe is the most recent figure, a little over 7. And we've talked about the need to put more money into reserves as we go on. So there's no currently identified project that would not occur as a result of using these funds to fund this particular project. What we would have is a general capital reserve with less funds available to it that we would then look to replenish via the long-term financial strategy and plan that Ms. Van Campina has been bringing forward. And that process of prioritizing projects would remain the same. So the only analysis, in my opinion, that we would be able to provide you at the next council meeting would be to do the process we've already done, which is to look at the current priorities and what is funded, and determine whether or not this is a vital part of operations or not. And the conclusion we have reached at this point is that this is a vital part of operations. So the recommendation, if you remember the criteria that we use, the A, B, C criteria for determining which projects to prioritize. This was an A project when we brought it forward to council for this year's budget, and our expectation is it would remain an A project by virtue of the fact that we will lose functionality with the existing software. So again, coming back to the short answer to your question, it represents an opportunity cost and a need to further contribute to the capital reserve on a going forward basis, but it does not immediately result in another project not moving forward currently.
So if I might paraphrase, this is identified as a priority, and had these costs been determined at this level at time of budget, it would have been put forward at that because it is a priority. Great, thank you very much, that's helpful.
Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you, Mr. Wiggenbach, for your presentation. My question is, can you just give us the definition of unsupported, the software?
Unsupported. Currently, there is no vendor that can fix LDO when it breaks. We do it in-house.
So did they go out of business, or?
They no longer support the software.
Just abandoned it?
End of life. Yeah.
And so when there is an issue, you have to jury-rig it together somehow?
Yeah, and currently I'm the only staff member who knows how it works in IT.
Ooh.
So guess what I did on Thursday for 6 hours?
Ouch. There is also proposed a new term position to do the implementation. Any idea how long that term position is scheduled for?
Could be up to 6 months for the implementation.
Okay. So the budget that you're proposing here covers that transition period of migrating all the data and setting it all up?
Migrating the data, working with the vendor to do the implementation, making the decisions around how workflows process and how we handle permits, what information we want to make available online to the public, all those types of implementation questions.
And I think we've learned something from purchasing software without having some help in implementing it in the past.
Yes, we've had two very large projects recently, the Recreation System Project and the Human Resource System Project. In both cases, we underestimated the amount of staff time, and staff in both cases stepped up with a great amount of overtime and got things done. In both cases, I think that we've recognized there are better approaches.
So once this is up and running, we expect a better user interface?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
From the public or just within the department?
To the public, we will have the intent is to have a public-facing services site that will reflect what's going on in the system for applications, permits, the process of approvals, these types of things, as Mr. Fish described earlier. Ideally, if you were a contractor, you could submit your building permit online. You could see that somebody's received it. You could send your drawings in electronically. You could see the process. It's currently under review by this person, scheduled to be complete here. It's going to engineering for engineering review, and you'd be able to see the processes where it's at. Right now, all of that is done by phone.
Okay. And so when you improve that front-end intake, do we have the staff resources in-house to actually process more applications faster? That would be another question, I guess.
I would say we do, given that a properly functioning system would likely be less work for the staff than the workarounds that are currently in place with the existing LDO system.
Okay, thank you very much.
Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Your Worship. Mr. Wingenbeck, I got to tell you, my heart goes out. I just had a manufacturer dump me on my backside with a piece of software in exactly that circumstance. I know where you're coming from with it. However, I got a bit of a tough question. At $330 to bring this in over a 10-year period, and at $24,000 a year with $57,000 a year, could we not create a job for someone to run this?
Likely
go ahead, sorry.
Just to address your question, likely one FTE working year-round at their position would not have the capacity to perform the duties required of the automation and the software.
Thank you.
And I guess to that point then, given that where we're trying to get to is more and more online, it doesn't follow then to not do it in this manner. I mean, I had a similar question just out of curiosity, and having somebody sitting at a desk doing this manually may get the work done, but it's not moving us forward in efficiency or approach. That's how I thought about it. Councillor Russell. And
thank you. I appreciate your point, and it's nice that maybe great minds are thinking alike on this one, but I keep getting my flashback every now and then to my inner work tech thing where that's been haunting all of us for way, way, way too long. And when I see something of this magnitude, it reminds me of how work tech was presented. I'm fearful.
Fair point.
The one other question I have is just out of curiosity, would the term position be within IT or in planning, or how does that look?
It would be in planning. The intent would be to backfill a planning position so that one of the planning staff could be dedicated to the project. Typically, when we see these application projects being set up, they begin at 80% IT and 20% the department we're working with, in this case planning. And as the project moves on, that shifts all the way down till it's 10% IT and 90% planning. Initially, there's a lot of IT work to do, and then in the first month or so, that really shifts into a 50-50 split because there's a lot of implementation decisions that have to be made by the department that the software is going to be used by.
Great, thank you. Are there any other questions at this time? See none. Thank you both for your presentation. Then I will move the council increase the budget for capital project number 1707, planning and development tracking system, by $180,000 for a total of $330,000, with the additional amount funded from the general capital reserve. Speaking to the motion, I'll support the motion. It is a lot of money. I mean, coming along at this point in our budget and operating timeline, but I appreciate the critical nature of the software. When I think about this needing an additional 180,000 sort of mid-year, mid-budget, it makes me think of a conversation I had just recently with a taxpayer who was unhappy about increased taxes on his property, and he kept referring to what we do here as always jacking things up. We just keep jacking things up. And I wish people would sit in the room or at least watch and understand how complex some of these decisions are. So an additional $180,000 is not chicken feed, but it brings such vital value to the operation of the municipality. So I'm just curious if in that resident's mind this would constitute jacking things up, or whether they would recognize it as a really important part of our operations. Anyways, that's a bit of a rant, I suppose. So I'll support the motion. Councillor Cressert.
Thank you, Your Worship. I'll also support the motion. I have to say that it's these sorts of decisions that I find are the most difficult to make in some regards, and fortunately we are not asked to do so that often, because these decisions really put us in between a rock and a hard place. They're important things to get done. But we go through a budget process, and then we realize that sometimes things don't go as planned. I do take comfort that these reports are looked at through various levels of administration, and I do recognize that attention is turned to whether or not the project should be shelved or not. I think the administration really seriously turns their mind to that. What I would like to see going forward is more attention in the report, just so that it's front and foremost, what is the impact? What is the analysis that was done to determine that, in fact, this priority still should go ahead despite other priorities and that sort of thing in the future. But I appreciated the answers provided by administration, and I was satisfied that that was the process used here. And so I, as I mentioned, will support this motion.
Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Your Worship. Well, thank you for your presentation, gentlemen. It's very good to explore all the avenues in a big ask like this, and I'm pretty confident that you know what's required, and that when the project went out for consideration, that you may have had an idea of what the scope of the software was going to be, but obviously after investigating, you come up with a much higher number. And I know that it's this kind of thing that you have to inquire about and maybe find out more specifics. And I will support the motion, but I'm especially happy that to allay Councillor Russell's fear of implementation, that you've actually put some funding into this for the implementation, because I think that's where we have big struggles with software, because this organization is very diverse, and I think there's a lot of demand on the organization for, especially in the planning department, with all the different factors that you have to deal with applications, et cetera. That increases the cost, but I think that cost is well justified, and I would like to see this project proceed on a good level with good resourcing along the way for that implementation part. So I certainly will support it, and that's all.
Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Councillor Sanford, as well. I'm really torn up with this because, again, you know, without dwelling on my inner work tech nightmares, here we've hit. This project came out, we approved it, we came out with a budget, and now here we are 6.5 months after budget, we're more than double. Scares the daylights out of me, particularly in light of the long-term financial strategy presentation we all recently sat through. That said, it breaks my heart because these guys are sitting there, there's nothing worse than pulling through crummy software or some, you know, getting that call, I'm sorry, we're not supporting your software anymore. Too bad, we'll sell you a new one. Like, this is just the worst of all situations we can come back into. You know, I've got faith in the IT department. They haven't let us down so far, but man, this just scares the daylights out of me.
Further discussion on the motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion is carried unanimously. Moving on to item G2. Servicing, grading, and building foundation work for multifamily rental employee housing development at 1451 Palliser Trail. DP 2017-080. Mr. Gravel.
Good evening, Your Worship, members of council. My presentation is in regards to Northview Apartment REIT's proposed rental and employee housing development located at 1451 Palliser Trail. The proposed development is intended to be 148 units with 3 separate buildings. The application is split into 2 development permits. Development permit application number 1, currently before council for a decision, proposes and is limited to approval for site servicing, grading, and building foundations. Development permit application number 2, anticipated to be before council for decision later this fall, deals with all other aspects of the development. The rationale for the split is that the developer, Northview, wishes to begin and complete site servicing and foundation work prior to winter. Otherwise, construction may not commence until 2018. The planning department conducted a review of the application. The proposed building foundation footprints are compliant with all requirements of the district. For example, the foundations are set back as required and do not exceed the maximum site coverage permitted. Although other aspects of the development, such as landscaping and parking, will be considered for approval as part of the second development permit, a site plan demonstrating basic compliance with these other site elements in relation to the building footprints was submitted. So basically, if you approve this, are they still able to meet their parking requirements, their landscaping requirements, and so forth? The site plan was reviewed by all relevant departments. No issues were identified that would require council to approve a substantial variance as part of the second development permit application. The engineering department also conducted a review of the application. The submitted civil drawings were deemed to be compliant with the engineering, construction, and design guidelines, and therefore the engineering department has no objections to the approval of this development permit application. The DC district for the site requires that a Steep Creek risk assessment be completed, as the site is within a Steep Creek low hazard zone. A Steep Creek risk assessment was completed by BGC Engineering and concluded that, based on the proposed development, the individual group risk is within acceptable levels. Furthermore, development of the site should not transfer or increase risk to adjacent areas such as the hospital or TP Town. The site is in close proximity of the Lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor. The DC district for the site requires that an environmental impact assessment be completed. The applicant's EIS has 2 phases to represent the 2 development permit applications. The purpose of phase 1, submitted with the first development permit application, is to establish all baseline information for all environmental disciplines listed in the terms of reference. For example, wildlife, noise, groundwater conditions within the site and adjacent to the site. Second, to evaluate the effects of construction on these disciplines, as well as propose adequate ways to mitigate these effects and monitor their success. Phase 2 of the EIS, to be submitted as part of the second development permit application, will address effects from human use, operations, and maintenance of the development. Results of the Phase 1 EIS indicate a number of minor environmental effects from construction, such as effects on air and water quality, introduction of weeds, and changes in viewscape. These were anticipated and are generally consistent with similar types of development. With respect to wildlife, the report identified the potential for changes in wildlife habitat as a result of removal of on-site vegetation, changes in wildlife movement as a result of construction noise, and changes in mortality risk given the potential for exposure to construction site hazards like traffic and so forth. The EIS proposes a number of mitigation measures to address these effects, for example, limiting the project's footprint, development of a noise monitoring and abatement plan, and education for contractors regarding wildlife interactions and protection. As per the EIS policy, a third-party review of the EIS was undertaken. The town's consultant, Associated Environmental Consultants, Inc., abbreviated AE, conducted the review of Phase 1 of the EIS. Their review identified 3 key concerns. First, that there is missing baseline data for noise levels. Noise levels can impact the stress level of some wildlife species. However, the noise level from the current noise level from the highway already exceeds this threshold, so it would be very difficult for Northview to mitigate their construction noise to be below the threshold. Second, that more study is required regarding elk displacement from winter forage habitat, including any negative externalities associated with it. This will be addressed in the second phase of the EIS. Finally, the baseline conditions and impaired functionality of the lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor were not fully characterized. Although Phase 2 will evaluate the cumulative effects of the development, AE feels that the biophysical characteristics of the corridor, including its width, its length, and its slope, are inadequate for proper functionality. Furthermore, there is evidence of high amounts of human use and disturbance. For example, there is an unauthorized Frisbee golf course within the corridor, and this will increase with future development. As a result of this, AE recommends that a multi-jurisdictional long-term management plan be prepared and implemented to improve and maintain the functionality of the wildlife corridor. While administration believes that it is reasonable for the applicant to mitigate their impacts from the development on the wildlife corridor, we do not believe it is reasonable to require the applicant to solely develop a management plan and be responsible for addressing the functionality of the corridor, especially given that there are other adjacent, existing, and some future developments that are or will be affecting the corridor. Administration believes that it's the responsibility of the town and the province to lead this initiative. As a result, administration is recommending that council direct administration to develop a comprehensive management plan for the lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor to address these concerns. Given that the application is consistent with planning and engineering requirements, and administration recommends that council approve DP 2017-080 subject to the conditions of approval listed in the Schedule A. Also, to mitigate some of the wildlife issues and corridor issues identified by the third-party review, the council direct administration to develop a comprehensive management plan for the lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor, including a detailed implementation plan. This concludes my presentation. I would be happy to answer any questions that you may have.
Thank you very much. One of the last points you made around the suggestion that the comprehensive management plan shouldn't fall entirely to the town, but co-managed. I think you suggested the town and the province leading and other landowners involved in that planning. That's what you're suggesting?
Yes, my understanding is that it would be the province and the town that would primarily lead that initiative.
Sure. I mean, clearly there's quite a related impact to the Silvertip lands around the functionality of the wildlife corridor and all. Has there been any discussion yet with Stone Creek Properties on that suggestion of a comprehensive management plan?
My understanding is there hasn't been, but maybe Mr. Fark has more to add.
So I would indicate that one of the challenges is that a number of the remaining Stone Creek properties to be developed no longer require an EIS as part of their development because they are already approved and an EIS has already been conducted, albeit a number of years ago. So although there are some aspects of their future planning that we understand may require an EIS, the majority of units identified do not. So we do anticipate needing to have that type of conversation with them at some future date, but that conversation has not yet been initiated.
So the approvals in place there don't require any sort of management plan at all?
No, they do not. And I would add that that is one of the justifications for why administration feels that laying the responsibility for ensuring the proper functioning of this corridor solely on this development, given how much other development has been approved and is approved on a going forward basis, does not seem reasonable. So the intent here is to have the town lead and in discussion with the province and other landowners, a multi-jurisdictional and multi-stakeholder approach.
Sounds reasonable. And so in the report and in the attachments, the EIS itself identifies a number of minor impacts, but only minor in nature. And the third-party review acknowledges some areas will require further study in phase 2, but does reference specifically the displacement of elk winter forage and associated changes in wildlife interaction dynamics. So has anybody out there had any conversation with the third-party reviewer around that?
Yes, a number of conversations.
Okay, so can I just ask, it seems counterintuitive to me to think that a patch of land immediately adjacent to the Trans-Canada Highway and surrounded by other busy roads is a piece of elk winter forage that we would want to encourage or wouldn't want to displace the elk from using it. It seems like to me, a dangerous place for the elk to be foraging. What was the third-party reviewers perspective on that?
The perspective is that whether that is the most desirable location currently for elk to be foraging or not is less relevant than the fact that that is actually what is occurring. So when they're looking at the baseline conditions, they're looking at it is currently forage for elk, and therefore its loss will result in some forage loss and some displacement. And the consequences of that need to be factored in and considered when looking at moving forward with the development. So the scientific world doesn't necessarily take into consideration things like what might be considered a common sense view on that specific location. They are considering the factors of there is existing forage that will be lost and that is a consequence.
Mm-hmm. Historically, all of the valley was forage.
And I think that that's one of the interesting challenges about this development is that similar to other conversations we've had recently around EIS and our relationship with wildlife, is that this project is demonstrating that it doesn't matter what the location is in town, even in a location in the middle of a highway roundabout, can have implications for wildlife, and that is a factor that comes into play in the decision-making process.
Yeah, well, I continue to struggle with some aspects of this, as I think our whole community does. I mean, the intent of a corridor is to provide room for the wildlife to move through. We're not trying to attract them down into the town site to forage. So if the intent of the corridor is to, Mr. Fish?
Yeah, could I just add one point? I mean, the loss of forage is an unfortunate issue anywhere that is outside of wildlife corridor. What makes this unique is its immediate adjacency to the highway. So a small shift of animal behavior in this location, we want to ensure that we're not resulting in higher wildlife mortality as a result of motor vehicle collisions, which is a potential, and so hence the need to look at this issue further in the second stage.
Okay.
And make sure that adequate mitigations are put to make sure that the elk don't move into the highway even more, and instead that we encourage them to use the wildlife corridor that's designated.
Right, thank you. And I guess that kind of segues into another question, and you may or may not be able to provide any sort of an answer, but when thinking about the comprehensive management plan, do you have any notion of what that may end up recommending? Anyone?
Or Nathan, if you want to answer that.
Right ahead, Mike.
So there are certain things that we could anticipate that will be recommended. So the concerns will be around, well, first of all, the displacement of the animal movement, which Mr. Fish was referring to. So some mitigations to ensure that the direction of movement of the animals does not move towards the highway but moves away from it. And then on the human use aspects, so we could see a combination of education, enforcement for people on the human use aspect, and infrastructure on the human use aspect, and maybe dual purpose infrastructure like fencing that would address both human use and animal movement. So those are the types of things that we could anticipate that will come out of that.
So you said the F word, fencing.
I did.
So you're anticipating the possibility of fencing being suggested as a management tool on that corridor?
Can I just clarify that there are many different types of fencing? So the current Palliser development, the Hector and Blackiston, also have an element of fencing. It's a wooden low 2-rail fence, and it's primarily just intended to discourage human use, and that's in place in a number of locations over town. So fencing could also include that kind of low scale. It's not necessarily animal fencing that we see more commonly in the park or in a few other locations east of the park boundary.
Of course, it hasn't been that effective at keeping people out of the corridor, but I guess that's another point.
Yeah.
Those people that live over there in Blackstone.
And so what I would add to that is, this I think is entirely the point of the of developing the comprehensive management plan, is to better understand these issues and to look at what mitigations might be required. One of the challenges with this project is that some of the mitigations will only be known, or some of the recommended mitigations will only be known at the conclusion of the phase 2 of the EIS. A point that we feel is important to raise for council's information is the following. In discussions with the proponent on this project, North Ureet NPR, who are advancing this project. So when we're talking about the town and other stakeholders being involved in leading a management plan and looking at mitigations, the developer in this case has acknowledged that they may have a role in playing that as well, even though the consequences of the impact on the corridor extend well beyond this particular development. So they have indicated, we have an agreement with them for up to $100,000 in cost contribution from their side to contribute towards mitigations. Now, the exact breakdown of that will only be known once we complete phase 2 and we understand, and we have the management plan, and we understand what those mitigations might look like. But in this case, the developer is coming to the table and saying, okay, we understand, and as long as we have some upset limit certainty in terms of what the cost might be, we understand that we need to be a part of that process.
Thank you.
But so, if I could just finish that thought, the important point from administration's perspective is that council understands that if there are mitigations that are recommended, there could be costs associated with those, and that given the fact that there is a large amount of already approved development through which it might be challenging to compel a contribution, that if there are costs associated, the exact cost sharing of those costs is unclear, and so there may be some significant responsibility to the town. So again, the developer has acknowledged that fact and has indicated a willingness to contribute up to a reasonable limit, but council needs to be aware that the implication of this is potential additional cost to the town as well when looking at what future mitigations might look like.
I think it's good to keep that in mind. Just thinking about the previous parts of this process and the suggestion from some in the community that this site should be reserved for a landmark building rather than housing. I would assume that for this type of study, it is not that relevant whether it was a housing project or some sort of landmark. I mean, whatever ends up being considered on that land would require similar sort of study.
That's correct. Basically, the third-party reviewer has suggested that there's current issues with the functionality of the wildlife corridor. That doesn't change if the site is not developed. So there's sort of no going back, I guess, from that conclusion.
Councillor Comfort, I just kept stalling until another councillor had a question.
I just wanted to confirm that, so the EIS and the third-party review both seem to say that the current functionality of that wildlife corridor is already compromised. Is that correct?
That is the opinion of the third-party reviewer, yes.
So, and that corridor, when I look at the map, although I could have gotten it wrong, does it end at the highway, or does it continue over the highway and then go to the ditches and then go to the other side of the highway? Or is it like, where does it start and stop, I guess? I did look at the map, and it seems to end at the highway. So that's the provincially designated wildlife corridor, is it? Or I just lose track of the boundaries. Like, I know there's a wildland park over there higher up, and
it continues past the current Holiday Inn and around the cemetery and turns, I guess it's kind of east up the hill above Eagle Terrace. Where we are also facing some challenges with managing human use and user expectations of corridor areas.
Right. Okay. Thanks for clarifying that.
Are there other questions this time from council? Seeing none. Thank you very much for your report, presentation. That then I will move the council approve DP 2017-8080, subject to the conditions of approval set out in Schedule A, and that council direct administration to develop a comprehensive management plan for the lower Silvertip Wildlife Corridor, including a detailed implementation plan. On the motion, Councillor McCallum.
Just a friendly amendment, perhaps. It doesn't note in the second part of the motion where the funding for the plan development will come from. And it's mentioned in the staff report that it would come from Capital Project 1624. And I wondered if we should insert that on the tail end of the motion.
Sure, friendly amendment.
Up to $100,000.
It's 100,000, the number reference somewhere?
50 to 100.
Okay.
Get all fancy with a piece of paper.
Okay, to be funded, what'd you say, to be funded, what's it say?
The funding for plan development come from Capital Project 1624 to a maximum of $100,000.
Okay, friendly amendment. Discussion on the motion. Councillor Russell.
Thank you, Worship. Thanks, guys. This is a tough report. Couldn't you bring something simple? This is so fraught with ambiguities that I don't even know where to start at it. We don't seem to know. We're not sure. Everyone's working to their full capacity with this, but we might have to do a study, and we might have to do some fencing, we might mitigate. We seem to be jumping free fall into this, and I'm not sure that's such a safe place to be. We build a foundation, we permit the foundation. Then if we find out we get into conflict over the mitigations, or if we're only $100,000 max to the developer for mitigations, we find out it's $500,000 or $600,000 or $700,000 by the time we get through the study. We're buying ourselves a problem, and I don't know if there's a fix to this. We've hit, for once we've hit, or not for once, but we seem to have hit where the environmental stuff is. We need to choose to follow this and do this right. If we don't, and we just jump ahead and try to steer through here, I'm not sure we're doing a good thing. But I don't have a better solution.
Further discussion on the motion? I'll speak briefly to it. I will support the motion. I recognize some of the concerns that Councillor Russell references. I think the report details quite a reasonable approach to moving forward. The pitfalls, as you would characterize it, are understood for the most part. I think it's important to move forward with this project in that location and have confidence that the comprehensive management plan that's yet to come forward will provide a reasonable approach to managing the wildlife and use of the corridor adjacent to the site. Further discussion on the motion? See none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion carried with Councillor Russell in opposition. Moving on then to item G3. Heliport Monitoring Committee Complaint Update and Annual Report.
I believe that the planning department is not particularly impressed by my PowerPoint presentation skills, and I believe the recommendation I'm hearing is that in the future I should get Mr. Johnson from the engineering department to do my presentations for me. Yes.
They're a little dry. They are a little. They are.
Microsoft Word on a screen. My fifth grader, oh, she's sixth grade.
Yeah. Unfortunately, sometimes time constraints dictate the outcome. So, good evening again, Mayor Borman, members of council. I would like to give a very brief report as to the status update on the heliport. So there are two things that I would like to update on tonight. One is there was a complaint received by the heliport committee, and I would like to report on the outcome of that process. And then I'd like to provide details as to the annual report for the heliport monitoring committee. So in May of 2016, a complaint was received by the town administration regarding general noise disturbance by the heliport. The Heliport Monitoring Committee was advised of the complaint, and a meeting was held with the complainant in June of 2016 to hear their concerns in person. Following the meeting with the complainant, the committee met 3 additional times in 2016 to discuss the issue, recognizing that this is a challenging problem. The result of those meetings was a recommendation from the committee that the town request from Alpine Helicopters, who operates the heliport, that the Alpine provide information, data, flight logs regarding their flights, and that they provide information around both past and potential future mitigations. The town received that information from Alpine in December of 2016 and January of 2017. Unfortunately, time constraints, similar to my PowerPoint skills, have not allowed us to bring it, to advance it sooner than what we did. However, last month, the Heliport Committee did meet again and to finalize the discussions on this complaint. And so what I would say is the Heliport Committee summarized the complaint as follows. So although they recognize that the disturbance experienced by the residents was a legitimate concern and was having an impact on their peaceful enjoyment of their property, the committee confirmed that Alpine is operating compliance with the schedule of a conduct of a helicopter or heliport business schedule of the lease. Sorry, that's a mouthful. They did have a recommendation that we request information from Alpine, which we have done, and then based on the review of that information, the Heliport Committee opted to make no further recommendations to Council to any potential changes to that schedule of the lease. So from the perspective of the Heliport Committee, they have heard the complaint. Alpine is compliant. There is no further step to be taken at this time. There is a recognition that this is a 10-year lease, and we are halfway through it. And as we get closer to the lease renewal date, no doubt there will be a renewed discussion and conversation around the location and the operation of the heliport when it comes time to determine whether or not it is appropriate to extend that lease again. So that was the conclusion of the complaint. The complainants have been notified of the result, and obviously they are somewhat disappointed. One bit of positive news we were able to indicate to them, and I have discussed this with Alpine as well, it is now public knowledge that Alpine has been successful, or was the successful chosen proponent to secure the heliport by the casino at the Stony Nakota. And Alpine is doing some future planning to consider what impacts that may have on their operations here, but there is at least the possibility of exploring some transition of operations that would allow for a mitigation of noise here in the future. So that is some positive information that was able to be provided to the complainants. So that is the conclusion of the complaint. In addition, the annual report from the Heliport Committee for 2016 was very brief. There was one complaint received, and that complaint was supported by at least 3 other residences, and it was not a spelling error in my report. I was not saying residents, I was saying residences, so referring to households rather than individuals, because each of these households at times had 2 or more people who were in support of the complaint. So there was one complaint received, supported by at least 3 residents. Of course, the committee confirms that Alpine is operating with compliance with their lease, and as I indicated, there are no recommendations at this time from the committee to Council for changes to the schedule. Alpine provided a brief annual report as well that provided some information and some interesting statistics. The 2 most interesting ones that I thought I would share with you, the first one being the tour passengers from 1995 through to 2016. And you see that although we are on an upward trend, we are not yet even at the highest point that tour flights have been at in Canmore. and that there is actually still room for additional flights within the current lease conditions. And this is a chart summarizing the different types of flights and the total number of flights over the last few years, including the full flights for 2016. And with that, I will answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Councillor Comfort.
Yes, thanks for your presentation. I'm just wondering, when is the lease up, and at what point would we begin negotiations regarding the renewal of that lease?
So the lease is up in 2021, and the lease does state renewal conditions. Normally it's a 90-day period prior to renewal of the lease. In this particular case, I believe that administration would be in discussions. Probably we would want to start discussions within a year of the conclusion of the lease with Alpine, to allow for proper time for planning and to allow for a community engagement that can reflect the best way to move forward.
Great, thank you very much.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. Do we have any idea what the new RFP arrangement, if they have a lease with the Stonies, as to how long that lease goes for?
So everything about that remains non-committal at the moment. So what is public is the fact that the Stony Nation went out for an RFP and that Alpine was a successful proponent. Yeah. However, to my understanding, no contract has actually been concluded yet. There are still ongoing discussions. So there's no certainty that a contract will be concluded. And then, assuming that a contract is concluded, the timeline and the conditions of it are not yet known. So although there is some optimism that that could provide an outlet, it is too early to make any statements that would provide any certainty.
It'd be great if they could take the .2s out there. I think that would relieve a lot of the concerns.
It certainly would. Whether or not that could occur, assuming that they come to a contract, remains to be seen and would be part of Alpine's internal business plan.
Of course. Thank you very kindly.
Just curious, Councillor Russell, if you wanted to add your perspective, given you're on the committee.
Not a lot to say with that. The last meeting was probably one of the best meetings they had, because Alpine brought along one of their more experienced pilots who's in a management role, and the guy was just a whiz for answering questions and putting things at ease. And you know, they're doing the best they can with what they've got, and their operation at the Stony Center is all up in the air and really not much of our business.
So my understanding from previous discussions was that there wasn't unanimity on the committee in regards to how to move forward with this, or what conclusions to draw?
The minutes reflect that at the last meeting, the vote was unanimous in terms of the three confirmations: that Alpine is operating consistent with their lease, that there is no recommendation to council. So two points, sorry.
Councillor Russell?
Mr. Farks covered it.
Okay. Some interesting data in the provided, just two charts, but the high point there in the late 90s that shows on that line chart shows more passengers in those years than we've had through the early part of the 2000s anyways. It's starting to climb up again as of 2013. But is there something about that chart that isn't obvious, or am I reading it correctly?
So I think there was a combination of perhaps economic conditions at the time, but there was also the restrictions that were included in the lease. So currently there are restrictions in the lease that set when flights can occur and the number of flights per day, and those conditions did not previously exist. So it's entirely possible that a combination of, you know, no prohibitions on number of flights and flight times, in addition to different economics at that time, contributed to those much higher numbers in that time period.
So the current lease that we have is the second 10-year lease, isn't it?
It is.
So the first one was been approved in 2001. Okay.
So the difference in terms of the number of flights that occur is the actual length of the flights itself. So not until 2004 did Alpine helicopters feature anything more than a 25-minute or a 30-minute flight. They put a 0.2, a 12-minute tour. And so I think that the 12-minute tour is actually the straw that's broken the camel's back in terms of more and more flights, because it is literally you get up and you get down, you get up and you get down. Like a 12-minute flight's not very long. It gets you out of the valley quickly and then back in, whereas the 25-minute and the half-hour tour, one can get you back to Marble Pass, the other one will get you back to Assiniboine. And so you actually are gone out of earshot of the valley, whereas when you're in the 12-minute tour, you're still in our valley the whole time. So in 2005, I'm trying to remember how old my kid is, that was when that tour was being heavily marketed overseas, and you would get groups of 70 people doing 12-minute tours on Long Rangers and Jet Rangers, 4- and 6-passenger machines, whereas prior to that, in the 90s, it was all 25-minute, half-hour tours, and it was also the heyday of bus tours. That was when bus tours were the way of getting around Banff National Park, and Canmore was a stop along the way. And so you would literally have 5 and 6 buses in the parking lot, and you would just be rotating them out. They also had a flight tower, and you would actually call your flights from the tower at that time as well, from your VHF radio. So there's a difference in the tourist, there's a difference in the tourism market, and there's a difference in the product that's being provided in the last 10 years than in the 10 years prior to that.
Okay. Thank you. So the report is short and to the point, and that's all that we ask of the committee, to ascertain whether the terms of the lease are being met or not, and they are. The question about noise mitigation, there's some details in this report. But
yeah. So the noise mitigations that have been conducted so far, primarily there are two. One is that a few years ago they switched tail rotors on all craft flying out of Canmore to a quieter tail rotor than the previous iteration. And so that was a sort of operational upgrade. The other thing is that they've gone to all 6-passenger helicopters now rather than having 4 passengers. So that reduces the number of flights that are required to move the same volume of passenger. Beyond that, unfortunately, there's not much that can be done. And the primary source of the noise complaint is the takeoff and landing. So it's the first few hundred meters above the flight deck that generates the most noise that affects the homeowners. Once they get up to sort of cruising altitude and they're moving to their destination, even on the 12-minute flights, the noise is less impactful. It's the takeoff and landings that is the problem.
Yeah, I appreciate that. The data from on tour flights on the last page of the report, 2016, shows number of flights July and August, which are the busiest months. So that indicates that the average number of flights per day are 25, 30, somewhere in there those months. But we don't have any data that tells us when those flights, I mean, those 30 flights aren't taking off over a 10-hour period or whatever. They're likely taking off and landing over a 3-hour period.
Right. So they provided us with flight data, including sort of takeoff and landing times, and an analysis of that was done actually by the CAO. And there is certainly some grouping of flight times. A lot of it tends to be weather dependent. Wind tends to pick up in the afternoons here, and wind is an impediment to flights. So yes, you can have a number of flights clustered together in a short period of time and still be compliant with the lease.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's clear that they're compliant. Just trying to think further down the line, and find what options there may be for improving the situation for the residents in the district. Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Worship. Thank you, Mr. Fark, for your presentation. I just had a question for you about the one of the issues that was highlighted in the report by Alpine about the UAVs.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And they suggest that they're prohibited within 5 nautical miles of both the Canmore Hospital and the Canmore Heliport?
That's correct, yes.
Does that more or less cover the whole valley bottom of our footprint?
Yes, it would cover a significant amount. And in fact, I believe that in general, within the town of Canmore, we do not permit the operation of UAVs, even notwithstanding these prohibitions.
Okay, and so are people aware of that? I mean, is that something that the general public has been brought to awareness of?
We don't advertise the fact, similar to we don't advertise a number of regulations law. I mean, the information is available, and when we get inquiries, we inform people.
Mm-hmm.
We do not provide a license for the operation of UAVs in the valley, but we're not doing a proactive information campaign either. I know that Parks prohibits the use of the UAVs as well, so everything in the park, and they've done some communication around that.
Okay, because they've had a serious incident that's been reported here, so it is becoming an issue that people should be aware of that, I guess, for safety's sake.
Certainly.
Thank you.
Councillor Comfort.
Yeah, I would concur with Councillor Sanford. I have been up at off-leash, and I had somebody fly, so I don't know what the specs are for a UAV, if there's different kind of models that are recreational and more commercial. This one flew right up to here, looked at me, and then flew away.
Right up to where?
Right here, my eye
right
level.
To your face?
Yeah.
Huh, so again, why didn't you just swat it out of the air?
Couldn't reach, wasn't fast enough. That was a while ago, it was some time ago, but recently I've seen drone footage by various people on Facebook of around the valley, so perhaps it's something that we should put out there that it's...
Certainly, we can look at communicate.
Oh, Sally.
Dr. Cottle?
So while we don't permit it, people can get a license through, I believe it's Transport Canada. I'm not, there's a federal agency who does do licensing. So some of the things you'll see on Facebook are photographers who do get appropriate licensing. So while we don't allow it, there are regulations that people have to follow. And if they are following those, then they are permitted within some of the areas that are restricted. So it's not necessarily a question of it's not allowed. It's that if you're flying it, you need to make sure you have the proper licensing, and we don't manage that licensing.
Okay.
So if there's no further discussion on that, thank you for the report. I appreciate the committee's done its job. I do continue to have a lot of empathy for the residents that are bothered, but it's just something we're going to have to work on as the lease comes to renegotiating point, I guess. So with that, we'll move on to G4, which I added, and this is very brief. Most council may know that the province had directed the Alberta Boundary Commission to rejig all of the electoral district boundaries. Ms. Hyde, do you have that overhead? And the MLA had contacted me a couple of weeks ago to ask if we might have any input on it. I was also contacted by Reeve of the MD of Bighorn, Reeve Cooper, who noted that most of ID5, almost all of Canada's country is in a different electoral district, and MD of Bighorn felt, and I agree, that we should give input to the Boundaries Commission, suggesting that the Banff-Stoney boundary should reflect the entire, all of the Kananaskis Improvement District within the same district. I just wanted to bring that for a brief discussion here, and if council is of the same mind, then there's 2 weeks, I think, left to provide input to the Boundary Commission. It appears that the Nordic Centre, at least, is within the same district, but most of the rest of Kidd, including the village, is in a different district, would be represented by a different MLA. And frankly, it seems counterintuitive to me to have it so. Councillor McCallum?
What are the communities in the upper right-hand part that are included in that proposed boundary?
Upper right-hand part?
So I can't... Yeah, what are those communities? Oh, that's...
I don't think there's any communities per se. The MD, you know, the benchlands, not benchlands. Yeah, it's called benchlands.
Is that part of the MD way up?
Yeah, I think that echoes or follows the MD boundaries. Yeah, just up to Sundry.
Is that Sundry?
That's outside of the...
I can't see it, I'm sorry.
Sundry is outside, so it's just the MD of Bighorn boundary?
Yeah, so essentially it's Banff, Canmore. I mean, not all of Banff National Park, but town of Banff, town of Canmore, Stoney Nakoda, Tsutsina. And that's about it. Yeah. So just a quick discussion, as I say, if there's general agreement that there's value, as the Reeve pointed out, and they're not largely driven by tourism matters, but Canmore and Banff are, and Kananaskis is also, and we work with K Country on our seniors housing and have on the economic, like tourism Canmore, Kananaskis. There's a whole lot of ways in which we interact with Kananaskis. Not that we couldn't in the future, but we do depend in some cases on provincial support, which means the MLA support, and it would be difficult, I think, to get MLA for whatever the district is south of there. I can't remember, Highwood, I think, to even care about what's happening up here. Councillor Russell?
Just following that one, where was Tsutsina previously? Was it part of Highwood?
It wasn't, I don't know honestly, it wasn't in this, it wasn't in Banff Cochrane constituency.
Yeah, it just seems like it's sort of a misfit.
Well, I assume the Boundary Commission feels there's value in having all of the First Nations in the region in the same, represented by the same MLA. I just have to assume that.
Makes sense to me.
Yeah. So, I suppose I'll just put a motion forward, unless there's further discussion at this point. So I would, didn't prepare this ahead of time, but move that the town of Canmore provide feedback to the Alberta Boundary Commission, suggesting that the entirety of ID number 5 be included within the Banff-Stoney Electoral District. And speaking of the motion, if that motion is carried, then we can prepare a letter and have it sent within the next couple of weeks so that it's also considered. Any discussion on that motion? Seeing none, I'll call the question. Those in favor? Opposed? Motion's carried unanimously. And we'll move on to the last item, H1. Councillor Russell suggested there be some sort of a verbal report on the Quarry Lake Trail. Mr. Fark.
Mayor Borman, members of council. You will luckily be spared another one of my PowerPoint presentations on this one, as I did not have I did not have time to prepare. So a short update on the Quarry Lake Mountain Bike Trail. So the short summary is this. The project was approved by council as part of the budget process at the end of 2016 for the 2017 budget. The project is on land jointly owned between the Rocky Mountain Heritage Foundation and the town of Canmore. Let's approach it this way. The land is zoned NP, which is natural park. There are provisions in the land use bylaw that set out what are permitted and what are discretionary uses there. The addition of non-motorized trails are a discretionary use in NP. The land use bylaw also sets out that in cases where the town is pursuing its own project on essentially town-owned lands, a development permit is not required. The location of this trail does not meet the definition of adjacency as set out in the MDP or the land use bylaw, and therefore does not require an EIS. The rationale behind this project all along was one of eliminating some of the informal trails, formalizing the trails with trails built to an international standard to improve both the user experience and the safety and liability element. It was also intended to reduce user conflict by creating dedicated trails for bikers and allowing other trails to be used by other users to reduce user conflict. And most importantly, this was intended to create an amenity in an area that is approved for human use in order to discourage the amount of human use that takes place in the wildlife corridors and the habitat patches. And here's, I think, where a lot of the community concern has been raised. People point out that there are bears and other animals that use that area, and therefore we should not be doing anything that encourages human use. What we've learned through recent scientific evidence, the number of reports presented to council recently, both in terms of EIS and third-party reviews, but also from parks in terms of their experience with the wildlife monitoring, is really it's either a space for people or it's a space for animals. This idea that certain uses are okay for coexistence, but some other uses may not be, is not accurate. So we saw an example of this just recently, over this past weekend, with the bear closure in the Quarry Lake area. Quarry Lake is a park that is used by thousands of people on a very regular basis. It's a very popular area. It's a recreational area. It's an area where we want to encourage human use and provide those amenities like the lake for swimming in order to prevent people from going in and recreating in the habitat patches in the wildlife corridors. To suggest that it's okay for the thousands of users to use the park for swimming, hiking, walking their dogs, but somehow not for biking is not consistent with the information we have about human-wildlife conflict. So if we want to limit use in Quarry Lake because we consider it a valued space for animals and for wildlife to move through, then the consequence of that would be a need to limit all human use in that area. And we don't believe that that is a productive or effective or a community desired outcome. What we do believe is that if we can provide, again, amenities in places where we want to encourage human use, we will decrease the amount of human use in the corridors and the habitat patches, which then makes it easier for wildlife to move through those areas and to make use of those areas undisturbed. And whereas now we have a situation where there is so much human use everywhere that there really isn't much distinction or differentiation for the wildlife in terms of where they are. So the short summary is that this is an approved project. It is consistent with the regulatory requirements. The Rocky Mountain Heritage Foundation Board has also approved moving forward with the project and has approved the agreement with CAMBA, who is the volunteer group who will be constructing and maintaining the trails. There is no further decision point coming to council. And I would further add that extensive community engagement has actually been done. So the open space and trails plan has been done recently, as has been the rec master plan, both of which identified, and I think you saw it in the community satisfaction survey actually this evening, at the recreational facilities that were the most appreciated were those of trails. So the The community has provided input in terms of what facilities and what amenities they are looking for, and this is consistent with that. With that, I will answer any questions you may have.
Sorry, that was the Quarry Lake survey that you were just referencing?
So, no, the citizen satisfaction survey that we just saw earlier this evening, at the top of the list was of appreciated facilities was trails.
And I can't remember, and I haven't had time to try and find a copy, but the survey that was done a couple of years ago around Quarry Lake, do you know off the top of your head what it says in this regards?
So the survey indicated that there were some enhancements desired, improvements to parking, washroom facilities, those types of things, that there was a general desire by the community to not see commercialization take place at Quarry Lake. So there was opposition to any vendors, food trucks, that sort of thing from taking place, that people generally speaking wanted it to remain in a natural state.
And, thinking about question that we heard earlier, and I've heard from others around public engagement. I've been thinking about that, and honestly, I can't think of any public engagement that's ever been undertaken for trail construction. I don't know if anybody with the organization think of that. I mean, Legacy Trail, for instance, or the Higashikawa Trail, or it's just not generally part of the process.
So again, I would argue that a certain public engagement process was gone through with both the Open Space and Trails Master Plan and the Recreation Master Plan. Sure. So there was broad community consultation that took place. Furthermore, the budget deliberations were public, and the inclusion of this project as part of the budget was obviously made public. Sorry? It's top of the list. And we have had conversations with the local trail societies, so CAMBA and the CTA, which is part of the Friends of Kananaskis group, have been involved in this and are both participating in this project and are supportive of this initiative. So,
thank you, Councillor.
Thank you, Your Worship. Thank you, Mr. Fark. I was wondering if you were aware of the current status of building the trails. CAMBA's been contracted by the Heritage Foundation. Where's it at? Has it been designed and is it being implemented? Or?
Yeah, so the initial trail design has been completed. An agreement has been agreed to between the parties, between the town, the foundation board, and CAMBA, and they are scheduled to start work on the trails in the coming weeks. They have not yet commenced the actual work.
The contract itself, is it signed by Rocky Mountain Heritage Foundation as well? I thought it was just a contract with the town. No,
so the agreement requires the signatory of the foundation, the town, and the entity, and the foundation board has approved executing that agreement.
Councillor Russell?
Thanks. You answered so many questions. I'm not sure I really have much left to ask. Undermining, they identified there was some concern with that. Has anything been done to deal with it?
So we have engaged with Mr. Jerry Stevenson, who's the sort of recognized historian and fountain of knowledge when it comes to things undermining. And we have worked with him to ensure that the alignment of the trails will avoid the high constraint areas, and that that should sufficiently mitigate the concerns around undermining.
Thank you. And the second question I have, I'm not asking you to send this tonight, but could you forward some reference points for the recent scientific studies, please?
Certainly. We had the Alberta Parks came in and gave the wildlife camera data. But yes, we can provide.
Yeah, it's not tonight. So like that's way over the top, but just if you could, please, that would be nice to review.
The Human Use Management Review we conducted, certainly.
Yeah, no, I thank you, Your Worship. I appreciate that, but I just, a bunch of evidence, stuff done by Parks, things that I'd like to see that and be able to direct people who are voicing concerns.
Sure, we can provide links to those.
Councillor Sanford.
Thank you, Worship. Thank you, Mr. Fark, for that update. I just had a question. Could you just remind me, this bike trail, is it a multi-use trail?
So this would be a purpose-built bike trail. That's not to say that other users couldn't use it, but the intent here is, what we often find and what people often complain of is user conflict. So bikes tend to travel at a higher speed than hikers or dog walkers. And so the intent here is to separate user groups rather than have multi-use. So the trail will be constructed in such a way as to be appealing to mountain bikers and less appealing to hikers and dog walkers or runners who will then be able to avail themselves of the other trails in the area.
So is there a parallel or a nearby hiking trail that will, or a multi-use trail? I mean, are all the other trails still multi-use?
Yeah, so there are a number of existing trails in there, both formal and informal. The majority of them informal that we are not planning to decommission at this point.
Okay, so there are other trails that people can hike on. This will be designed for specifically biking.
Yes.
But people could walk on it if they wanted to, but then the user interface is not that comfortable on a trail like this.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you.
And I think it might be realistic to imagine that providing that trail primarily for the mountain bikers will have the effect of pulling them off of some of the other trails to reduce that conflict. It seems like
That is entirely the intent, yes.
Councillor McCallum.
Thank you, Your Worship. Another thing I would just like to confirm, and I'm pretty sure I know the answer, but publicly is always awesome. This is not a mountain bike skills park. It is a trail.
That is correct.
Thank
yes.
you.
Yes, there will be features.
Features, but it's not like what we have at the bottom of Benchlands. That is a skills park.
That is correct.
This is a trail.
That's right.
Thank you.
I think there has, because of what we went through with the flow trail, I think there's confusion that this is meant to replace what was just not approved for there. So I'm trying to message it appropriately that it's not that kind of a facility, it's a trail. But
yeah.
Any other questions for Mr. Fark at this time? Seeing none, thanks very much for your report. And with that, I'll move the council be adjourned. Those in favor, opposed, we're adjourned.